My fellow Westorians, I'm Aziz. With me is Ashea, and this is Valar Rereadis. A Dance with Dragons is the longest of the books so far. It's also the darkest and least understood, thanks to being the most recent. It's the culmination, also so far, of George's style honed over the course of the prior books and the rest of his long career. It has the extended length of A Storm of Swords, the expanded pacing of A Feast for Crows. It brings POVs together like a Clash of Kings, and has the setup of a Game of Thrones. If you're watching live, you can feel free to ask live questions. You can also send questions and comments ahead of time by joining us on one of our social media outlets. Facebook, Flick, Discord, and Slack, all those places have discussions running. Also want to give another shout out to the Indie Shops thread on our Facebook group. It's a list of places you can do some holiday shopping or shopping outside the holidays. A lot of small outlets there. Good stuff. One of the cool things about shopping at a small store or shopping locally is that, you're going to make somebody really happy with the gift you get them, but you might make that shop pretty happy too. So it's almost like you're buying two gifts. But it's not a gift. It's perusing a business. So let's check out Isle of Faces podcast, Scraps and Scrolls. That's Joe Buckley's show. Make sure you're keeping up with that in tandem with us right here every Sunday. And check out Nina Friedel's goodqueenalley.tumblr.com blog. It's quite excellent, and a lot of the thoughts you hear in this show are expanded on over there, in addition to some entirely different topics. If you missed the announcement, we did some reorganizing on our main podcast feed, and that should enable easier access to episodes that are split apart. Part ones weren't all next to part twos based on our prior release schedule. Now that we've got the ability to move them around a little, we're trying to make it more organized. Should make it a lot easier for listening to things in a row, things like that. So our feed is large. We have a lot of episodes. So over the years, we haven't had much ability to do much about that, the way podcast feeds work. So it's nice that things are changing and we can get a little more organized. They gave us the ability to do it, and we're taking advantage.
And honestly, if you're perusing our podcast feed and you see something, you're like, yeah, I think these should be together or this should be set new, feel free to let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, Ashea. We're open to feedback. We sat there and thought about where to move things to, and there's no right or wrong way to do it. It's really just a preference. So we'd love to hear from you guys, because heck, we don't listen to our own episodes except when we're editing them. So we're not the target audience. So today we have Bran 3, the one with Winterfell Weirwood visions, aka that might be Jojen paste.
Jon 7, Return to the Grove of Nine, aka The Gang Meets 1-1.
Daenerys 6, A Cloak of 1,000 Flies, aka a Tokar of 1,000 Lies.
And finally, The Prince of Winterfell, False Vows Before a Heart Tree, aka the one with Frey pies.
I am wearing a Winterfell shirt today because thoughts and dreams of Winterfell are prominent, as we have our first chapter there since the end of A Clash of Kings. Can you believe it? Yeah, no, really, it's been that long. People certainly talk and think about Winterfell, gets mentioned a lot, but the first Bran chapter in A Storm of Swords, they're already on the road. So, yeah. Theon observes much, too much, really, but he also remembers Winterfell. Jon also thinks of Winterfell. As a boy there, he wanted to be Daeron the Young Dragon. As a man now, he wants to replicate some of the ways in which Winterfell manages winter itself on a practical level. Mostly that means food. Bran as well thinks back on Winterfell, his own childhood, as well as through the ages, using the eyes of the heart tree there. Binding vows are a theme today as well. Dany officially agrees to marry his Dar, and this one after making the decision last time, while Jane Poole marries Ramsay in front of a heart tree. Neither are marriages of love, of course. I doubt either of the husbands in this scenario survive the long term. Meanwhile, more vows are said as 6 join the Night's Watch in front of 9 heart trees. Those are nice vows, unlike the weddings. Bran, too, is wed to the trees. They, in fact, use that phrase, so it's not even turning a phrase. That's what they say. So those aren't nice either, but possibly vital. Would it be a set of A Dance with Dragons chapters without more cannibalism? No. Of course not. Bran may have eaten Jojen without knowing it. If not, well, he did eat people earlier in the book, so he's at least on Team Cannibal already. As Astafori refugees continue to suffer, some have begun to eat their own dead, so yeah, that's more of that. And this exchange says it all. Man must not eat the flesh of man, said Aggo. It is known, agreed Ricardo. They will be cursed. They're past cursing, said Simon Strikeback. Simon has the right of it. Nearly every case we've had of cannibalism has been driven by desperation. Like this Astapori one we just mentioned. Definitely not all, though. Certainly not in the case of Wyman Manderley, who we have today, the famous Frey pies. That falls under the revenge category. On the heels of cannibalism, why not mention all the tastes and smells and sights in this one, as the sensory descriptions continue unabated and powerfully. Brandon Stark could taste the blood, a line we'll never forget. His sight is restricted as he's told to embrace darkness. Nevertheless, we see the children of the forest, the cave system, so many strange and wondrous and vaguely to completely terrifying things, and of course his corpse mentor, Bloodraven. You know, trees growing through faces. Yeah. Jon slips into Ghost once or twice during his chapter and experiences wolf senses, one of them being the giant's very strong musk. Dany's chapter starts with a stench so appalling she almost gags while Theon attends a wedding filled with incredible foods that almost make up for all this until we realize that Freylent pie is made of people. Many things are expressed in grand terms. 1,000 comes up so very often to describe far gone times or numbers too large to truly count. Melisandre's chapter perhaps kicked off the short run of this last time. She saw Bloodraven's 1,000 red eyes, saw 1,000 skulls, even heard Dolorous Ed joke that 1,000 wildlings could be hiding beyond the tree line. The 1,000 eyes and one of Bloodraven are noted again more directly in Bran's chapter. The children tell Bran that they've lived in this cave system for 1,000 years. Bloodraven tells Bran the same math applies to the frequency of greenseers being born, meaning 1,000, which is 1 in a million. While Jojen's green dreams are also said to be 1 in 1,000 occurrence. Meanwhile, they find the thrones of thousands of long-dead dreamers deep in the caves, strong evidence of support of the staggering claim of these caves being occupied for 1,000,000 years. Weirwoods are said to perceive 1,000 human years as a human perceives a moment. And through that, Bran is told he can see 1,000 years in the past, though it seems for once 1,000 is actually an understatement. Not to mention a very, very strong contender for the most famous A Song of Ice and Fire quote of all time, which we'll read in full shortly, but it's got something to do with readers and 1,000 lives and living them. Yeah, something like that. Hizdar promises Dany 1,000 nights of marriage, while Daario claims to have slept with 1,000 women. That's not quite as grand as the stuff in Bran's chapter, but I didn't mention the 1,000 flies on the dead man's body that looks like a cloak. Okay, that's not really that grand either, but it's another example. Theon isn't even trying to compete with all that. No thousands in his chapter, really. While Jon also stays out of this race except for hearing that Stannis' army has grown to 5,000, which is more than triple where he was at. There's also a great deal of timelessness. Under the hill, time passes for Bran in a way he's never experienced, nor have we experienced a chapter like it. Theon notes the timelessness of the Godswood as the extremely unusual mists surround them. Jon and company head to the undisturbed ancient grove of Nine, confers with a giant, and this is a creature something out of time, all while doing things no one has ever done before. While Dany faces objectionable but long-standing marital traditions, as well as other traditions far worse and just as long-standing, also while doing things no one has ever done before. Here's an amusing but interesting pattern. All 4 chapters today start with the something. The moon, the sun, the stench, and the hearth. We'll talk about how these concepts feed the variety of themes we've just mentioned. To be clear, those are the first 2 words of each of the 4 chapters. For the first time in a while, we have cause to note a theme of music and song again. It's back, all right. Though they're not happy songs, they're also not mere backdrop. They're pretty important, as if they ever were in A Song of Ice and Fire. Well, okay, occasionally they're just backdrop, but when there's music around, you should pay attention, extra attention. During Theon's chapter, music is particularly prominent, with none other than Mance Rayder being the man to provide it. in disguise. Of course, it's for a not very happy occasion, Ramsay and Jane's wedding celebrations. The songs Wyman Manderley calls for are not actually played, tell quite a story as well. Meanwhile, in Jon's chapter, he notices the song-like qualities of the old tongue, while Bran hears the children of the forest sing the songs of earth in the true tongue while learning. They call themselves just that, singers of the songs of earth. And that's where we start. Bran 3, the one with Winterfell, Weirwood visions, a.k.a. that might be Jojen paste. I was actually thinking we'd just skip this one. It doesn't really seem that important. I can't even say that with a straight face. Of course, it's the opposite of that. It's one of the most important, groundbreaking, and riveting chapters, period. Given the glimpses into the unexplained, a bit of light in the darkness, and the darkness is strong, but we're given reason to embrace it. So is Bran. Of course, a chapter like this couldn't be so powerful without all the buildup. Like, if you were to start with a chapter like this, it would be a little confusing. But the narrative technique is different here, and that's one of the things we've been led to understand, one of the things we've gotten used to, so we notice a lot of things when they're different, when the patterns are different. We take note. So it's a standout chapter amidst standout chapters, perhaps we could say. Not only are the supernatural elements off the chart, but there's a huge dose of history and world building, not to mention massive character and plot work on top of all that. As of this recording, there have been 3 Bran chapters published since 2001. That's not a complaint. Rather, it's me making a point that this chapter is precious, a finite resource. It provides the pinnacle of our knowledge on a number of seemingly crucial topics. So far, it has Eddard in it, Lyanna, Benjen, Duncan the Tall, young Nan, a glimpse of the earliest Starks when Winterfell was young, lots of other things. Wow, right? I mean, when you read this chapter for the first time, it had to be just astonishing, and it's still so the second time, the third time. It doesn't really cease to be incredible. And one of the other reasons it's precious, the first time you read this chapter, you probably thought there was another Bran chapter in the book, if not 2 or more. So did I. After all, we aren't technically halfway through the book yet, although we will be by the end of this episode. Still, that's a whole half a book. It's reasonable to have expected more Bran in this book. But this time we know better. We know that's all we get until the Winds of Winter. So let's do everything we can to understand it. It starts like this.
The moon was a crescent, thin and sharp as the blade of a knife.
Moon imagery is very important and repetitive throughout, not just to provide symbolism, but to show the passage of time, which there's quite a bit of. It doesn't happen a lot that we have several months go by within a chapter. And that specific line is chosen because we're going to spend both the beginning and end of the chapter focused on a blade. So the tone is very well set. Not to mention the setup for the rest of the books, right? It's pretty clear Bran is being saved for bigger endgame roles given he's so prominent early on. Like I said, only to have 3 chapters in 20 years. The 5-year gap may have created some of this. Even the show left Bran out for a season. So some of that is just the reworking of the story a little bit, but mostly I think it's just that Bran's big impact is going to be later. He's the sort of an endgame character. Still, it's the nature of Bran's story. We're just not sure. Of course, we can't be positive about these things. We're just making educated guesses. Throughout the chapter, George breaks up the actions of the characters with these snippets of the natural world, but not through Bran's perspective directly. And even indirectly, like it seems like he's looking through Raven's eyes and Summer's eyes, but it's not always worded that way. It's worded almost like a narrator, but it's almost part of how Bran is now. He doesn't have normal senses anymore. We're used to POVs where characters have sight, smell, touch, taste, the normal senses, but this guy has extrasensory perceptions that, well, none of us have experience with, so we're left to imagine and read George's vivid descriptions of it. I don't know actually how much time passes in this chapter. Like I said, it seems like several months. One suggestion we've seen is 3 months, which is pretty large. Now, Arya has a lot of time in Bravos working for Briscoe. A lot of time passes in that one. Davos is in prison, and we don't know how long that is. It's just another example of timeless feel. Davos being underground in prison, he doesn't even get to see the sun or the moon like Bran. But he's counting the days based on his meals. So Bran does think about how flying is better than climbing, which is one of the ways we know for sure, at least some of the narrative attribution is through these ravens. But it's all part of the style change. Bran's evolution into a green seer, a feature of this chapter, is an explanation of how Weirwood perceives time, right? And Bran is becoming part of that. So his perception of time changes. That's why I think that even though several months pass here, it doesn't necessarily feel like that, especially not from Bran's perspective, because he is becoming timeless as well. He is entering this world of where time works differently, and it's himself an aspect of it. Now, here is a quote that reflects that.
Those things belonged to the world above, where time ran in its iron circles, day to night, to day to night, to day.
So, see, it's just directly saying how he's not part of that anymore. The narrative style change, it absolutely reflects Bran's change as a character. It's really beautifully done. His awareness of the world is becoming transcendent. Thus, his perspective has to be as well. And that's a real challenge for an author, because it's not like he has something to build off of. He can't use his own experience. I guess that helps too, that there isn't exactly anyone that could contradict him. So note how frequently the moon is described. The rapid passage underlines Bloodraven's point in this chapter that, yeah, time is different for a tree than for a man. He hardly notices it. Certainly, Mira and Jojen notice. We'll get into that in a little bit. The next Bran chapter we see will be, I predict, even more outstanding in narrative style, because he's going to be even farther along on this journey of melding with the trees and of losing some of his boyhood. Kill the boy, that phrase is used a lot in Jon's chapters, but it's very much present here. And it might be a little more direct, depending on what the truth of Jojen is. So I really brace yourself for Bran, just his chapters, maybe not being like this, but I don't know that we're ever going to have young boy Bran, except for maybe little snippets. Maybe there's little teasers here and there, but I don't know. I think that's gone. Tree Girl notes a dichotomy that I very much appreciate here. While Melisandre's beliefs drive her to keep the dark at bay, Bran is taught to embrace it, and he does. Quote,
The strongest trees are rooted in the darkest places. The strongest trees are rooted in the dark places of the earth. Darkness will be your cloak, your shield, your mother's milk. Darkness will make you strong.
This is a great possibility for why Mel sees them as an enemy. We've been wondering about that. If she perceives their preference for darkness, she would find that abhorrent, because she's a little terrified of the darkness, because, as we said, some of it's trauma-based. But also it's deeply rooted in her religion, so it's kind of a double whammy. So people who like darkness, she's gonna side-eye someone like that at the very least. Now, I guess Bran finds Bloodraven's appearance abhorrent as well, but not in a "I'm scared of you," just that, boy, you're kind of gross. But he thinks to himself, in the dark, he could pretend that it was the three-eyed crow who whispered to him and not some grisly talking corpse. Yeah, he preferred what the manifestation of the crow in his dreams, and not this version of it, the real life version. Another suggestion of how they might be aligned as opposites, again, comes from Tree Girl. The children are of the earth. They sing its songs, after all. R'hllor is a fire god. Traditionally, trees, fire, don't get along so well. That's already addressed in the ancient history of Westeros, and how both the First Men and the Andals did some burning of heart trees, and of course that's not cool. If ice and fire sort of wipe each other out, earth will remain. Earth is like the balance restored again. Nature can take over. Maybe that's the angle for the children here, or what they were trying to do when they were at war with humanity so long ago. So this first paragraph in this chapter has this very earthy, natural feel to it, Joe writes, like we've entered the elemental. Discussed before how George's biggest strengths is getting across this feeling of nature and how it interacts with the senses. And it's just super well done here. It's almost the culmination of his ability to do that, because it's never more necessary, right? Never have we had such closeness to nature, such a character becoming so internalized with their connection to the supernatural, this particular version of the supernatural anyway. Obviously with Melisandre, we had this connection to, say, fire and different things like that. Nina writes, before finally mentioning the broken boy sitting upon a weirwood throne, this is a good example of the narrative technique being different. Is that really how a person thinks of themselves in the third person like that? I mean, that's not normal, right? So this is a good example of the narrative technique changing a little bit. And that's another example of how perception of trees is different. Bloodraven says they don't think about time. They perceive things like sun and soil and water, and that is what's happening. Bran's perceptions are reflecting, is merging with that concept. But Bran's powers are nothing like Melisandre's powers. We talked about some overlap, some things they have in common. But, she's a force to be reckoned with, don't get me wrong. And her ability to persuade and exist in the realms of men is formidable. She's a different type of character, too. I mean, she's not in a cave somewhere. She's directly dealing with lots of different people. If she resurrects Jon, then all the more so her power is apparent. But it seems like Bran has more raw power, just more greater scope, greater span. I mean, flame reading is hard for her. She says it's hard to learn to do right. It's taken decades, if not longer. And then we see her make errors at it. Bran may make errors too. We haven't gotten that far. But it doesn't seem like he had to suffer to learn how to see these visions. Like, they gave him this weirwood paste and he starts seeing visions and they're very clear, right? I mean, he doesn't understand what's happening, but most of the examples that, which obviously we'll get to them, we have a fairly clear idea, or at least a solid guesses on most of them. Definitely not all of them. So Melisandre took decades of practice to get to this point, and Bran's just there, right? He's still a boy. I mean, is he even 10 yet? Or he's close. So though Bran's powers are greater, he surely lacks something Melisandre has more than perhaps anyone else. Devotion to this cause, devotion to saving humanity. They both are kind of on that track, except Melisandre knows she's on that track. She's dedicated to it and nothing else, and has been so for a long time. Where Bran is still a boy, very much wrapped in his own story, his own personality, thinking about how his legs don't work and how he misses home. That's all long gone for Melisandre. She's not thinking about any of that. She also has the kind of level of certainty that is hard for a child to have. Bran, how is someone his age going to be so sure of what he's doing? He doesn't have a fully developed frontal lobe, and he's being asked to save the world. I mean, heck, he doesn't have the capacity to even understand what he's being asked to do. Save the world, Bran. What is the world? He's only been outside of Winterfell a little bit, and it's to go beyond the wall. He barely conceives what he's being asked to do, what he's being asked to save. And these are beings vastly older than he is, telling him how important his goal is and how important he is. It's really unfathomable. And amidst all these explanations of powers, the long-standing question remains about the exercise of it, the ethics of wielding it, the philosophy of control, various questions of agency. The stealing of Hodor's body, we've talked about this before, it's a perfect example. I don't think Melisandre would do that. Not because she's above it. She's not. She'll do whatever it takes. Let's be clear on that. But Bran taking Hodor's body to walk around the caves is leisure. It's him replacing something he's lost. It's FOMO. If Melisandre needed to take over Hodor's body to save lives, she would do it. When Bran did it, we gave him more of a pass. But here, when he's doing it just to sightsee, to just not be left out, that's dark. That's not good. That's an abuse of power. He's yearning to be normal, and we sympathize with that. And if most kids had Bran's power, they would probably almost all abuse it too. that's part of what makes this all so interesting, is that much power in the hands of someone so young. What does that mean? But Melisandre doesn't care about any of that. She doesn't care about being young. She doesn't care about, I mean, she needs to look young because it gives her power. But it's not for herself. She doesn't care about people fawning over her and telling her she's beautiful. That doesn't matter to her at all, apparently. Not as far as we can tell. She's all about the goal. She looks the way she looks because she thinks it will help her convince people to get on her path to save the world, not because she wants people to think she's hot. And Hodor, it's also not only is it dark, but it seems addictive, right? Bran hates his own body, and he sees the things he can do. Like he wants to comfort Mira, right? That's not it's a dark that he's taken over Hodor's body, but again, he's not. That's a good deed he wants to do. So it's very conflicting. Joe points out that the darkness of this mood, this tone, particularly comes with the third moon, when it's a dark moon. The warmth and interest has gone from the cavern. We're back to talking about dead things, the murders of ravens, how Mira and Jojen are very negatively affected by this place. They're experiencing the time. Jojen knows he's going to die. Mira knows Jojen knows he's going to die, but Bran is, what he's doing is so important that they just have to sit there and deal with it. They're basically giving everything, and they understand why, because it's so important. But that doesn't change the fact that they have to sit there and think about it all day long and suffer. And Joe wonders if Mira, of all of these characters, will be the one that ends up suffering the most, because she's going to live, quite possibly. We know Jojen's most likely to die, ditto Hodor, and Bran himself is going to become something else. And whether he's even capable of suffering on these terms, well, if you look at what happened on the TV show, the answer is no. But I think it's going to be more complicated, more nuanced in the books. But still, the idea that he will feel guilt or compassion for an individual when he's tasked with saving everyone may fall by the wayside, by necessity. It might be part of killing the boy. Again, we have reason to call on that concept. And we get the vibe from Melisandre more clearly that she knows that she has to cause suffering to reach her end goals. And with Bran, Bran's not clear on that. He doesn't realize that. And that's why there's this hint of darkness around him, that maybe he's being misled a little bit. Because, well, you can't just confront a child with all these truths. It takes a little bit of, well, you got to approach it different ways. You got to, it's like, how do you tell any young child dark truths about the world when they get a little older? You have to pick the right time for it. You can't put it off. Small scale versions of that is what I'm trying to get at. But it's not just that, right? Joe points out it isn't just the guilt. It isn't just the ethics of stealing Hodor. There's lying involved. He steals Hodor, and then he kind of spies on the Reeds. Like, they could be talking about him. We don't have that happen as far as we see. But if they wanted to share a private word about Bran, well, he'd be spying on them, right? They maybe already kind of know that, but I don't think they know he's inside Hodor. And he has to lie to them to say that he's not there. Like, he has to pretend to be Hodor. So, yeah, this is the kind of stuff that if you were a parent, you would clearly see this is your child needs talking to, needs to be straightened out on these issues. I don't know how you'd go about doing that with a kid with powers like this, but still you would recognize that. When he first has visions, he sees his father. Consider how this is an extension of using his powers to restore what he's lost. Just like he's using Hodor's body to be able to feel somewhat normal, to be able to have legs, he's using his visions to replace the loss of his family. They got to train him how to use his powers. That's part of the goal here. But initially, he's just going to do where his, as they say, you saw what you wanted to see. He's not disciplined. He's just seeing what he wants to see. Is he going to be strong enough to move beyond that? Probably. Will he conquer these yearnings, or will he perhaps falter? Also, maybe, probably. I think he's going to be imperfect. Like, it would be a little strange to me if he just, like, was the perfect savior. He goes from young child to, never breaking back into old ways, like never being a person again, never being tempted to look places maybe he shouldn't look. Maybe we want him to look into the heart tree and see different things in the past. And if we want to know examples of him faltering, we want to see what kind of consequences that might have. Well, very loosely speaking, wandering about unmentored with his powers was his undoing on TV as well, or an undoing. It certainly caused a lot of problems. So I think the version of that on TV is very different, but I think the notion that Bran might make a mistake, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, he's just a boy. Let's talk about the Children of the Forest for a minute. We've already established that Leaf has learned to speak Common. The others only speak True Tongue. And it's said that Brandon the Builder never learned to speak True Tongue, but he did learn to communicate with the children. And I think we're seeing the same thing here, minus the fact that one of them learned Common, implying that Brandon the Builder had powers too. And he used skin changing as a conduit, meaning a raven that could speak True Tongue, like they were apparently able to do back in the day, as this chapter tells us. They could speak directly. So if Brandon the Builder skin changes into a raven that can actually speak True Tongue, then he would at least either be able to understand it, if not speak it himself directly. So that makes a lot of sense as far as the pathway taken to make that work. It's a fairly well-established trope in fantasy to portray elder races as closer to nature because it reflects a similarity to our own ancient human ancestors in the real world, right? Thinking back to any of our own real-world ancestors or different cultures, they all lived closer to nature going far back. So that does fit really well. Most of the names are centered around nature, the children's names. One of them is called Black Knife. Wonder if there's a meaning there, if it's like an obsidian dagger reference or anything like that. Maybe they wield one. Who knows? It's kind of a neat name. But they're dying out. Here's a quote.
That was in the dawn of days, when our sun was rising. Now it sinks, and this is our long dwindling. In the world that men have made, there is no room for them or us.
At the beginning, Bran feels empathy and sadness over that story, but he thinks how it's different for children than for humanity, because he says men would never accept that fate. They would fight back. They would swear bloody vengeance, even if it was hopeless. They would try to kill as many of their foes as they could. Unfortunately, it bypasses him how large a part of the problem that aspect is. That's not a good thing, necessarily. It has its positives, and it may give us insight into what happened so long ago. The children are simply not as, not only is not as populous, but perhaps this killer instinct, this desire to conquer that might be innate to humanity on some level is not present in the children. And that gave them an advantage in these endless wars between the species. And that might be why the children stole humans and made them into the others, if that's indeed what happened, because it would be a way to turn humanity's innate killer instinct, its innate desire to dominate and slaughter that may not exist within the children's inner beings, and turn that against humanity. They don't have that weapon, so they take people, enslave them, and turn them around against the humans that are trying to kill them. It's compelling as an idea in terms of themes, but of course, it is just headcanon at this point. And after all, the others are, just physically, humans are more capable of killing, because, heck, the children are tiny, right? I mean, they can't pull bows or stab with as much strength, it's just straightforward in some of these, in a logistical sense like that. There's this line, men forget, only the trees remember. So that's a huge teaser because, yeah, they know a lot of things, right? We see in the visions that there's so much potential for George to give us interesting secrets, from anywhere in the entire history of Westeros. So that's one of the other things that make this chapter incredible, is just the possibilities it gives us without actually giving us them, right? We just now know that the mechanism exists for us to see almost anything. Bran is like the Dewey Decimal System. He just has to know where to look, and we will see it. So come on, George. Feel free to write really long Bran chapters where he's just peeking here and there and learning this and that. It doesn't even have to do with the plot. I just want it. But this also pushes back against the concept that the North remembers, or at least it redefines it. It means that the North is more of a concept than a group of people in this case, because it says men forget, only the trees remember. So yes, on one scale, in human time, maybe men remember, but in tree time, men don't remember. It's too long. In addition to the true tongue, we get snippets of the true histories, what the children imparted to humanity, such as the use of ravens, right? The way they used to be made use of. It sounds so much more interesting and spectacular. Like this is an example of devolution, right? If ravens could talk before and actually read the messages directly, well, that's better, isn't it? Than carrying a piece of paper. So it isn't all about progress and humanity making things better in the world. There's clearly good things have been lost, or wonders have been lost. And some of these things go back thousands of years. We see that there's the souls, for lack of a better word, of children still in some of these ravens. And clearly these ravens aren't thousands of years old. So these souls are maintaining somehow, passing down and staying around. Let's talk about Jojen briefly. We wonder about his death. Of course, he has said many times, today's not the day I die. And Rolling Knight makes a great connection here, similar to Davos and the Wolf's Den. We talked about the timelessness of being in prison versus being in these caves, which is a bit of a thematic link. But in both cases, too, Davos wasn't upset that he was going to die. He kind of was at peace with it. But it bothered him that he didn't know when he was going to die. It was the waiting, the not knowing. That's the point here. Jojen doesn't know exactly when. He may know the day it comes. He may be like, oh, today's the day I die. But before that day, he doesn't know, and yet he knows it's coming. It diminishes the value of your last days when you know they're your last days, but you don't know how many they are. If you knew you had exactly 10 days, maybe you could make a plan for 10 days. But there's something about not knowing that just throws the whole thing off, I guess. And it's worse, I suppose, when you're in a cave beyond the wall, far from home and everyone you know. So it's even more like being separated, and all the feel of timelessness and separation is heightened because of all that. And Jojen points out the Krennic men live closer to nature than the rest of mankind, and that enables them to still be closer to some of those ancient truths of the old gods. It's a similar concept that we were discussing with the ravens in speech. And Sophia from our Flick channel writes, more similar to the children than he is to a child. That's a great take, referring to Jojen. He is, and this has been set up pretty well because, right, he's been referred to as little grandfather before. And, well, the old wise men of the forest or old wise people of the forest is one of the terms that Bran thinks would be a better application. And, well, that certainly sounds similar to the way we're describing Jojen. One of the reasons you can tell this chapter is great, among many, is you can almost quote it at random. Just pick a sentence at random and start from there, and there's a pretty good chance you've given yourself fodder for huge amounts of discussion. The rabbit holes in this one are as numerous as all these unexplored tunnels within the cave itself. But it doesn't just have a quantity of quality quotes, it has one of the greatest of them all.
A reader lives 1,000 lives before he dies, said Jojen. The man who never reads lives only one. The singers of the forest had no books, no ink, no parchment, no written language. Instead, they had the trees and the weirwoods above all. When they died, they went into the wood, into leaf and limb and root, and the trees remembered. All their songs and spells, their histories and prayers, everything they knew about this world. Maesters will tell you that the Weirwoods are sacred to the old gods. The singers believe they are the old gods. When singers die, they become part of that godhood.
Ah, beautiful, right? So good. Such a great, fantastic line. It's in world, it explains things, it's formative, it's an underpinning, but it's also speaking to us, the reader. It's also the same concept Makoro and Tyrion went over when Tyrion's like, yeah, of course he's going to tell me I'm important. People like to hear they're important. Well, we're readers, and we were just told that we're, perhaps a little more experienced, or we've lived more lives because we're readers, right? We've lived 1,000 lives. So it's both telling us we're good, it's a compliment to us, as well as a deep philosophical take that has a lot of meaning and truth to it, as well as being world building. It's just so great. Death is not an end to a singer. This is a really important concept. When singers die, they become part of that godhood. That's the last line Shea read there. It's a transition for them. It's an afterlife. It's not an end. It's starting something else. There's a beauty to that, but there's also darkness to it because it doesn't apply to most human beings as far as we know. Maybe it does. I mean, Varamir did seem to become part of the godhood. We saw that from his POV. But he's a skin changer. Is it that way for all humans in the North, or just all humans, period? I guess we don't really know. But that seems kind of iffy. If it applies to Green Dreamers, then we're getting into Jojen's situation here and whether or not they feel that way. So the point is that if the children are willing to give sacrifices, if this, examples we've heard in the past of human sacrifice to heart trees, if that started with them or if it started with the first men, is a different question if it started with the first men. But if it started with them, well, it says a lot on their view of life and death and sacrifice if to them it's just a transition to another life. Whereas to humans, it would be terrifying because they don't necessarily see it that way, right? So if you're just passing on to the next life, it's not necessarily such a great crime. But if it's the one life you have and it's being taken from you, well, that's to everything. You've had everything taken from you. So the children seeing death differently is both an interesting piece of world building, an important part of how they see the world and life, but it's also a difference in their morality. That's a really important thing to keep track of. And this brings us to Jojen Pace, the theory. Because it is a theory, it's one of the more unusual possibilities we're faced with. It undoubtedly fits. I don't think a single person would be like, oh my God, Jojen that really happened. Because it's just out there as a possibility. Certainly, if you've listened to this podcast one way, you're aware of it. But so even those who doubt it's going to happen acknowledge that it's entirely possible. After all, no one doubts that Jojen's going to die at some point, least of all Jojen himself. On the other hand, the evidence is entirely circumstantial. It's a strike against the theory, but there is a lot of it, which is a mark in its favor. So let's run through both sides of it pretty quickly, like just point by point. I don't want to get too deep into it, but we will try to be comprehensive. First of all, sacrifices to R'hllor work in that we've seen it work. Not that they will always work, but we've seen very straightforward examples of burn someone, the wind gets stronger, visions, things like that. So this isn't evidence. Again, it's circumstantial, but it gives us precedent from the author that at least this sort of thing is not just wild and out of nowhere. Now, of course, inevitable death from Jojen doesn't mean death through sacrifice being eaten. So it's not necessarily evidence that he's going to be sacrificed, or was. He says he's not the one who needs to be afraid. Does that mean, and he does seem to say that in response to Bran saying, they're going to kill me? And they say, no, he's not the one who needs to be afraid. So it's indirectly sounds like they might kill Jojen, but again, that is not certain. There's sacrifice metaphors everywhere in this chapter. The sickle moons, right? That's what a crescent moon can be referred to. And of course, we have a sickle at the end of this chapter, so it's very fitting. And of course, the way it's described is thin and sharp as the blade of a knife. The counter-argument here is that Bran himself is being metaphorically sacrificed to the trees. It's him. He's wed to the trees. This chapter is far more about that than what else might be suggested. It could be both. Of course, the taste of the blood. When the sickle bronze sickle is used on that dude in the last vision. He can taste it. That is very odd. The fact that the tree can experience that, he can experience it. It's like a time travel of senses. It's very peculiar, very dark, very interesting. Quite a way to end a chapter. The weirwood paste itself looks like blood to him. Well, a lot of things look like blood. A lot of them. The sap of weirwood has been set up a lot that way. Whether that was meant to set this up or whether it's just meant to be thematically rich. Wine is very often a metaphor for blood, or the other way around. That comes up a lot, the blood of Christ, that thing. There's this line too. Almost every day they ate blood stew, thickened with barley and onions and chunks of meat. Jojen thought it might be squirrel meat, and Mira said that it was rat. Bran did not care. It was meat, and it was good. So, yeah, it's kind of a setup for sounding like he doesn't care what he's eating, that as long as it's food, there's blood in it. I mean, he's already eaten human flesh without his knowledge, as we said back in his first chapter of this book. He also at first refused to eat the elk because he thought of it as a friend, but then he had to because he was just starving, and he just had to. Now he's not desperate here, so there's that argument doesn't exist. Like, oh, he's got to eat Jojen. That doesn't really work. But you could say there's desperation of a different kind. They're not starving, but the threat of the others is so great that maybe it calls for desperate measures. So, yeah. Archmaester Emma points out how this progresses chapter by chapter. Chapter 1 of Bran, he eats a pig, or he eats a person that he's told is a pig. Chapter 2, he eats an elk that he sees as a friend. So, this chapter, did he eat Jojen? Quite possibly. Certainly, Bloodraven has been portrayed through his life as a guy who believes in the greater good, and the ends justify the means. So from his perspective, sacrificing some kid to stop the others, he would not scruple against that. So it's not certainly not that. And again, that's not a counter argument. It's not an argument, though. It just removes the counter argument potential. 3 chapters before this one, this is a very strange quip by Mance Rayder. He says, I was eating bean and bacon soup whilst Bowen Marsh was going on and on about the high ground. If some crow wants to slip a knife between my ribs whilst I'm spooning up some supper, he's welcome to try. Hobbs gruel would taste better with a drop of blood to spice it. It's just a strange line talking about the high ground. And I mean, the cave is on high ground. They had to go up the hill to get into this cave of the three-eyed crow. And just random talking about blood in a bowl again. It's just a little peculiar to me. Again, though, this is hardly evidence. It's just part of this pastiche of things that seem to connect. Corran Halfan orders his men to put blood in their porridge when they're fleeing beyond the wall. He says it'll help them be nourished. But Jon says it's nasty. It choked him. It was so bad. So was Mance just making a joke here? I mean, it doesn't sound like it would actually taste good. I don't know what's going on here. And once again, just because there's talk of blood in bowls doesn't mean it was Jojen's blood. Joe Buckley with a good catch here. The similarity between the children of the forest named Snowy Locks and the old woman who cuts the man's throat with the bronze sickle. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I never noticed that one. That's kind of cool. Here's another line. Jojen Reed was too weak to walk unaided. He was settled in the bowl of an oak. The bowl of an oak. Hat tip to Ravenous Reader and Durin Durrandon on that one. But also, what little of his face could be seen beneath his hood and scarf was as colorless as the surrounding snow. So, Now, the term bowl, that's B-O-L-E, bowl, the bowl of an oak. The phrase bowl, it comes from Old Norse, the prefix B-O-L-R, bowler, and it forms the word bulwark, which is the trunk of a tree. It comes from that. Bulwark, of course, is mean trunk of a tree, but it derives from that. So that's kind of neat. And blood drinkers in Song of Ice and Fire include a character named Boris the Breaker, whose sigil is bull's horns, and he founded House Bulwer. Blackjack Bulwer was one of the 3 heads left by the Weeper a few chapters back. Now, that's just a fun little connection. I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that's Jojen paste evidence. It's just kind of a fun rabbit hole that the extension of which was kind of neat, so I thought I'd relay that to you guys. Now, here's a few counterpoints to Jojen paste. Very notable similarity to shade trees, right? A lot of people have taken a look at that over the years, and A lot of really good interpretations on the connection between the shade trees that Dany ate before the House of the Undying and the weirwood paste here. The descriptions have a lot in common, for example. One counter argument here is that in that case, there doesn't seem to be any sacrifice involved. So if they're so similar, well, Dany's case lacks a sacrifice. Arguably, Dany herself was going to be the sacrifice, but that just pairs her up with Bran, who we talked about. Bran is the one being sacrificed to the trees here, whereas Dany was sort of being offered as a sacrifice to the Undying Ones before Drogon came in and burned all that down, quite literally. Shout out to Amy Blackfire and All Hail the Night Queen, who wrote about thematic differences amidst the clear patterns here. One thing they pointed out is that it might be that the shade trees are corrupted, perhaps even corrupted weirwoods from long ago, but a difference in their experience comes from that. Bran, sure, it's similar. The way it turns from nasty tasting to positive, that's one particular high-level similarity, but Bran tastes as sort of innocent things. Like he thinks of his mother, he thinks of like homely things and childlike things, whereas Dany's tasting of desires. Like she thinks of Drogo and blood, things like that. So it's a little more adult, maybe you could put it, but you could also argue that those are like more sinful, and that's part of the argument from corruption in it. So we know throughout the story, we've talked about it several times, that the power of King's blood is perhaps exaggerated, but there might be something to it. And that's if it's an exaggerated concept, then maybe the power of Jojen's Green Dreamer blood is also not really that relevant. On the other hand, it might be just that. It might be somewhat relevant. We don't have direct evidence of that, but it certainly seems possible. Another good example, this is one of the better arguments I've seen against Jojen Paste, is the fact that he says, "This is not the day I die," so many times. Would he really die off screen without us getting a chilling "this is the day I die" line on screen? That's a good argument against it. It's a very good argument against it. George is good enough to have us hear that line in retrospect and it still be chilling, but I feel like it would be more impactful if he did it just straightforwardly. Here's another possibility against Jojen Paste that I think is very compelling. It also fits better with what we saw on TV. Quote,
"The ward upon the cave mouth still held. The dead men could not enter. The snows had buried most of them again, but they were still there, hidden, frozen, waiting. Other dead things came to join them, things that had once been men and women, even children. Dead ravens sat on bare brown branches, wings crusted with ice. A snow bear crashed through the brush, huge and skeletal, half its head sloughed away to reveal the skull beneath. Summer and his pack fell upon it and tore it into pieces. Afterward they gorged, though the meat was rotted and half frozen, and moved even as they ate it."
These are things we haven't seen. I mean, a dead snow bear is makes sense, but dead ravens, ooh, that's kind of different. And bright blue eyes. I don't want to get into that rabbit hole right now, but just as a reminder, bright blue eyes, we pointed out with the quote last week in Tyrion's chapter of the dragons bright and dark. But the point here about Jojen is portrayed as waiting at the cave mouth a lot. He sits there and just gazes out into the landscape. And, well, what could happen, Nina's a fan of this option, is that the cave mouth ward could fail. And for some reason, and then those undead waiting right outside will be able to come right on in, and poor Jojen will just be sitting there. He's obviously not very capable of running. He's not in great shape or whatever. He's weak and frail. So that would fit. Certainly he's killed outside the cave mouth on TV. So that would be kind of similar, at least. Also, it really reflects well what we said earlier about how Jojen is a lot more like the children himself than a person, in how the children are not fighting their fate anymore. It's their long dwindling, their dying out, their extinction. And Bran thinks that, humans would fight back against that, but Jojen is more, he's accepted his fate. He's not fighting against it. Mira is sort of the champion of humanity here. She thinks he should fight his fate and say, why believe that it's such a foregone conclusion? She thinks that it's worth the chance that there's a way out. Take that chance, fight it. Personally, Mira seems safe in terms of her life. Of course, it's horrible, her experiences here. She feels helpless. She's always been his protector, and there's just nothing she can do here. I mean, she's the elder sister, and he's, not the most robust kid. The show also gives us some optimism for her survival. I don't, again, the show is never proof, but like I said, some optimism. And a reason against that is that Bran is sort of living out the last hero story, and the last hero story calls for all his friends to die. So that's not good. On the other hand, we're almost certainly getting a hold the door moment where they have to flee or at least block the passage or something like that. How the heck is Bran going to go anywhere if Hodor's dead and Mira's also dead? Like, how is he going to travel? So I think Mira needs to survive at least to help Bran, move from place to place. Someone's got to do that. A minute on Bloodraven himself. Of course, his real name is Brynden Rivers. Mentions the blackfish there as someone named after him. And he's this famous line, the brother I loved, the brother I hated, a woman I desired. I think it's kind of funny he says it that way because he could have said a brother I loved, a brother I hated, a sister I desired, but he said woman I desired instead of getting all incesty. I guess George wanted to leave some subtlety to it. Like, the fandom has figured out very clearly who this guy is. A lot of us knew it the second we saw him because of the birthmark and Thousand Eyes in One and all that. And then lines like this just sealed the deal. But having him just drop the incest bomb right there might have thrown the mood off of the scene. People are like, wait, what? Why did he desire his sister? Maybe you shouldn't listen to this guy, Bran. What's up with that? So the brother he loved is almost certainly Daemon Blackfyre, which is a big deal. Right? You might not realize why it's a big deal, but Bloodraven killed Daemon in war, and we didn't know he loved him. We just knew they were brothers. For all we knew, he hated him. So this was actually a big deal, this reveal that he loved his older brother, yet was, had to do what needed doing. It's a good example of Bloodraven being a man who believes the ends justify the means and believes that his duty comes before his things like love. It's very Jon Snow, very kill the boyish. And who did Bloodraven arrive on the wall with at the exact same time on the same ship? Aemon Targaryen. So it gives this character a lot more interest. Like, it fleshes him out a lot more to show this aspect of his character, the conflict within his own upbringing and difficulty he had within his own family. The brother he hated is clearly Bittersteel. I wrote Aegon here, but I meant to write Aegor. Of course, Aegor Rivers. And Shiera Seastar being the sister/woman he desired. What he's saying there is he didn't actually love her. He thinks during his life he loved her. He tried to marry her. But I think maybe it's a little sour grapes after the fact because she never married him. But he's saying that, in retrospect, I didn't love her. I just lusted for her. She was hot and I wanted, I was in my 20s, whatever. That's just kind of, that's how I interpret that, because he doesn't say he loved her, and that's pretty telling. He uses the word desire. And so he's a really interesting character. We obviously shouldn't get too deep in his backstory, given we've done that elsewhere. Bloodraven, we have 3 whole Bloodraven episodes, 2 from before he took the black, 1 from the point at which he began that journey, which ended here in the cave somehow. But a lot of other singers have ended there as well. It's crazy to see that there's just thrones of hundreds or thousands of other singers who are still barely alive. One of their eyes opens when they're passing by. And then that's Green Seers, but there's also Bones of Thousands of Singers, like Children of the Forest, that is. And there's only 60 now, apparently. They say there's 70 living in these caves. That is not very many. And here we have the Great Blackness.
The great cavern that opened on the abyss was as black as pitch, black as tar, blacker than the feathers of a crow. Light entered as a trespasser, unwanted and unwelcome. and soon was gone again. Cook fires, candles, and rushes burn for a little while, then guttered out again, their brief lives at an end.
What is blacker than this cavern? Nothing. There's none more black than this abyss. Yes, that was a Spinal Tap reference. Bran thinks of this cave as a place of protection, and that fits with what we've seen before from caves in the series. The Hollow Hill of the Brotherhood Without Banners, for example, is their refuge. And at the time, we pointed out how it was full of weirwood roots and how Beric Dondarrion himself, one-eyed, black cloak, looking like a stick. I mean, he looked exactly like Bloodraven, minus a few details and a little less aging. But, should be dead, isn't. It's just really amazingly tight parallel, right down to the surroundings. So, and in going back even farther, the caves where Gendel and Gorn, led their free folk into the caves beneath the wall to supposedly escape what was coming there. Yet, we have this ominousness of these caves as well, that you could just get lost in them. Like, it's so big that, they could be refuge, but you may never come back out. The way it's pointed, light is unwelcome here. Unwanted and unwelcome. Light entered as a trespasser, and it's even given a life. It says their brief lives are at an end, meaning to reflect more of the timelessness of this place. Because compared to the age of this place, everything is short-lived. And Bran himself, it's another mark of sadness. Yes, it's a place of protection, but it's also framed as if he's going to be here forever. He sees these older people that have been there forever, and it seems so unjust. I mean, Bloodraven had a full life before settling into his tree forever. Like, he was like 77 when he disappeared beyond the wall. He doesn't even conceive what Bran is having to give up. He's given up not just his childhood, but a whole life of experiences, a life's worth of living. And the idea that he's going to be without not just his family, but the people that he came with, he's going to outlive them all. It makes him sad that he knows he's going to have this long life. But what good is life when all you know is gone? Again, we come back to that seminal line from Miri Mazdur. That line has had so many instances where we've had call to bring it back. Okay, let's talk about visions. Let's get into that. There's some really good visions here. Of course, we got some RLJ sort of set up just by having Ned praying for them to grow up as close as brothers with only love between them, that Catelyn finds it in her heart to forgive. It's pretty hard to imagine that's anything but him talking about Robb and Jon, and Catelyn forgiving him for the lies about Jon's, concealing all that, not telling the truth. And seems, pretty sure. I don't know if there's even much more to say about it other than that this is building to bigger reveals about all that. That gives us two strong examples of Bran's powers being beyond even what Bloodraven conceives, though, right? Because in one of the times where he speaks to his father seems to hear him, and they don't seem to believe him. He's like, "Nah, you didn't speak to your father. Your father heard a rustle on the wind," etc. And also the ease at which he takes Hodor doesn't seem to be corroborated as something that should be easy, right? Varamir couldn't do it to Thistle much at all, and now Thistle should be harder than Hodor, but Bran is so young and nowhere near developing his powers yet. So they're not entirely wrong as part about in terms of what Eddard heard in terms of the rustling of leaves. In our Weirwood episodes, we were very thorough in researching the sound George uses to portray that, and it's always rustling. So, but Eddard did ask who's there. He's like, who's there? To be fair, you might say who's there if you heard a sudden rustling of leaves and you thought you were by yourself. You might think, well, there's someone around, like who's coming up on me. So it's really wonderfully open to interpretation. But I think most of us want to lean towards the supernatural here, that Bran he really is speaking to the past. And so the suggestion is here, right? We saw on the show that there was, impact on the past, and the suggestion was already there before that. It was known, it was discussed, it was predicted by plenty, though not the details. I mean, the moment this scene happened, scenes like this happened, people in the fandom started predicting little bits of time travel or how that might matter. It was not largely connected to the hold the door thing, though. That is something that just, most people didn't catch that, self included. So, the next vision is, of course, he thinks it's Arya and himself, but it's Lyanna and Benjen, and this references Rickard not wanting Lyanna to practice sword fighting. So, Lyanna's been mentioned now a couple times here in the last few chapters because even Roose Bolton mentioned her. And in the context of her being great at riding horses, and now we have her good at fighting with wooden swords. So that's kind of neat. It also reminds us that Benjen and Lyanna were close, which is something that is a real nagging detail in the whole R plus L equals J, the whole Benjen's role in everything. I mean, Benjen helped with Howland Reed, so he was involved somehow in all this. It's just unclear how, what he knew, if he bears any responsibility, if he bears any guilt. Big hidden thing there that is something that could be revealed through these tree visions. We get this naked pregnant woman wanting vengeance. That's one that we just are like, I've not seen a theory on that in all my years of covering and being obsessed with this series, that I was like, oh, that's it. That's the best one. Our best theory is Melantha Blackwood, who was married into the Starks. But even that it only fits. It doesn't really have a great compelling connection other than it works.
But if you're curious about why we think that that's possible, I would go to our Blackwood episodes.
Yeah, that's our second most recent scripted episode is Blackwood Part 2, and that is where we get into it. But Blackwood Part 1 is fun too. Check those out. The next one is almost certainly old Nan and Duncan. So young Nan and Duncan. It's a woman standing on her tiptoes, kissing a knight as tall as Hodor, and that's supposed to probably indicate to us that Duncan is Hodor's ancestor. Dark-eyed youth making weirwood arrows. The most popular theory for this is Brandon Snow, brother of Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt to Aegon the Conqueror. Brandon Snow was all about thinking he could kill the dragons using subterfuge and etc. So this is the timeline fits for this, sort of like the visions are going in reverse order. So really, this could be someone else. It's not Bloodraven, as far as we know. We have no reason to believe he was ever there. And Dark-eyed Youth doesn't necessarily work for him because his eyes are red, which they could be dark, but I don't think so. Now, Bran also sees statues from the crypts. He sees faces he recognizes from those statues as the tree itself is noticeably shrinking, which gives us a clue that the vision is sort of like in a top speed now. It's accelerating. He's just moving through the ages rapidly. And a good example for that is, if you want more on that, you can check out our Crypts of Winterfell episode. Also referred to a couple chapters from now. Bran's going to go down in the crypts. I mean, not Bran, but Theon's going to go down in the crypts. Sorry, not a few chapters from now, but next week. And of course, it ends with the sacrifice, the white-haired woman with the sickle, which I'm not sure what's that's supposed to tell us other than that the early Starks were part of blood sacrifice. Like, this is his family. This is part of Bran's own family history, is things like this. Sacrificing people to the heart tree at Winterfell. That may have been a Stark woman, like his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother, something like that. And it may make it easier for him to follow in footsteps of Starks who have done dark deeds if he sees that it's been his own family that's done things like that. If he has to make moral sacrifices, meaning like do things that he doesn't want to do for the greater good, or maybe the greater good without quotes. Maybe it really is, that for that. It's hard to say. I certainly lean that way. I think it is really truly is the greater good, but Bran will have to take on a lot of darkness to accomplish that. And so we look for ways in which that can happen. So yeah, all these things, all this talk about old Nan reminds Bran of being home. And this is where we get back to him as a person. He's being told indirectly to kill the boy, not unlike Jon, by the man who was very close to Maester Aemon. At least he was Lord Commander while Maester Aemon was Maester at Castle Black. So you got to admire, though, despite Bran's childishness, his ability to adapt here. He thinks for a minute how it'd be really nice. Hey, we could all be green seers. We could all be ravens. He has these childish thoughts, but he puts them away pretty quickly. He has this wistfulness, but he sets it aside. He realizes he's being childish. He realizes that that's not possible. They're just fancies that pop into his mind, which is sad because he's so young and he should be able to entertain those notions. But you can at least appreciate his burgeoning maturity in the face of so much. Yeah, and the moment where he's back home again, just that line. Then at once he was back home again. Joe writes, "This is just that line alone is capable of eliciting massive emotion because it's so badly where he wants to be. It's how he's abusing his powers, not to aggrandize himself, not to get greedy, just to replace what was lost." And this notion of those who get powers have shorter lives, that seems to apply to Jojen, not directly to Bran, because if Bran is going to have this extended life as a green seer, well, in some sense, he's almost infinite. In another sense, he didn't have much of a regular life. So he did give up, as we said before, his childhood and his adulthood as well. Joe brings up a point here. Does that apply to Euron? If Euron is a failed green seer, does he have that sort of short lifespan as well in line? Well, I don't exactly guess Euron's going to live a long time, so yeah. Joe also writes how perfect it is to have Ned be the one that Bran sees. What else symbolizes home and what he's lost than the first parent he lost? The math here is funky. You know, he talks about only one man in 1,000 is born a skin changer. Only one skin changer in 1,000 can be a green seer. That's 1,000,000, which that makes sense. Like, let's say we have Adam. Let's say we take Adam Whitehead's estimation of 40 million people all throughout Westeros. So maybe 40 green seer candidates at any time. Would it really? Does that seem too high? Maybe. Well, here's a reason why maybe not. Because, well, if you maybe you have the power, but you don't necessarily have the temperament. Like Euron doesn't have the temperament. You don't want to imbue that guy with a lot of power because he's going to abuse it. Whereas Bran, we just discussed how he has this childishness, this innate goodness, this complete lack of anything like greed or evil or desire to be cruel. That might be the missing link. Sure, you got the powers, but which of you 40-odd candidates has the disposition? That's the thing that really separates who is actually capable of taking on all this power and not just ruining it, not just going off, losing their mind, using it for themselves, things like that. That's, to me, that is what George is telling us, that yes, the power is one thing, but the means to use it properly from within is the thing that's truly rare to have both of those things at the same time. In these, with this language, check this quote out if we move on to the depths of this place.
The river you hear is swift and black and flows down and down to a sunless sea. And there are passages that go even deeper, bottomless pits and sudden shafts, forgotten ways that lead to the very center of the earth. Even my people have not explored them all, and we have lived here for 1,000,000 of your man years.
So again, 1,000,000 is 1,000,000, but 1,000,000 is not a ridiculous number at all. It doesn't sound like an exaggeration. I mean, it could be, but the Neanderthals who are extinct on Earth lasted at least 500,000 years and probably more. So it seems fine. Like those numbers doesn't actually seem too big. Let's see here. Singing, of course, it's important that the singers of the songs of earth are important in how we hear that through ancient legend. For example, the Rhoynish, their legend says the secret song that brought back the day. Lesser gods came together with singing. That's harmonizing. Harmony is part of what makes songs a great metaphor for the need to unite to fight against a common enemy, because that's what harmonizing is. Different people singing different notes that work together to create a beautiful composition or piece or solitary note that is stronger.
Not in my case.
Let's see here. A few more takes from you all. Tommy Pappas says, Super Chat says, really excited for the VR episode. Yeah, we just spent a lot of time on Bran, but it was time well spent. I think I'd say this chapter has taken over the top spot in most comments. People weighing in our different social media outlets. This probably had the most comments we've ever seen, which is ironic. I think it's funny, darkly funny, that all these weird things that Bran, or that rather that Mira and Jojen see, I guess Bran is technically there with Hodor, but he's not going to talk because he doesn't want to give away who he is. But they walk in that room where there's like upside down stone pterodactyl things, bats or whatever they are, and they see all the guy opens his eye, they see bones. No one ever says anything. No one's ever like, whoa, that's creepy. It's like, wow, what is that? No one says anything. They just like, huh, all right, there you go. Yep, that's kind of thing you see down here, I guess. So it's very, very unusual. So I think that's kind of funny. They didn't have much to say, but you guys did, and so did I. Jonathan Hagee says, Black Forest ham was traditionally covered in beef blood before smoking. I can see people beyond the wall doing something similar. Huh. What was that in reference to?
You were talking about Mance using blood to spice something up. A drop of blood spices something.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. Right on.
He's just sharing with us some cooking tips.
Yeah. Ham. And in that case, it was bacon. He was talking bean and bacon soup. So, okay. Yeah.
But
cool.
Yeah, I know the idea just that Mance and them would use that.
Yeah. Aegon the Sixth says, wargs summer and drags himself. Yeah, he does. That's true. He does drag himself.
Well, no, he was saying that if Mira were gone, if you were saying that, how would he get back anywhere?
Oh,
and so Aegon the Sixth is saying he could warg Summer and drag himself, which obviously that would, Bran would freeze. That would not work long term. But Brandon Winslow said, imagine Bran being hauled by Summer and they come upon Ghost with Jon alive in there.
Like, hey, I know you. A big topic of conversation that we're not going to get into because it's just too filled with permutations, many possibilities. We don't know what's going to happen. But the question is Mira's potential reaction to her brother's death. And the reason it's difficult to discuss is we don't know how he's going to die. So we don't know which version of reaction to discuss, whether it's going to be she feels like these children of the forest are evil because they killed her brother, or they let her down because he died because the ward broke, something like that. Rolling Knight wants to know, are there male children? Is that part of why they're dying out? It might be. It is certainly on the TV show. They were portrayed as only female, and all the others were male. That was certainly an interesting detail. And, well, Leaf was born a couple hundred years ago, it says. So if there were male children around, they existed then. So that is an interesting idea, though. Maybe the women live longer. That's possible. They're different species. So for all we know, the women live a lot longer than the men. Like in the real world, women do live longer than men, but it's not, hugely longer on average. So maybe for children, it is though. Maybe there's some sort of disease or some sort of reason why the males have died out. Certainly George has played with that concept before in his sci-fi novels. In the book Dying of the Light, there was an engineered plague that was sent to hit people living in caves. And it killed 99.5% of all the women. So it was a way to try to wipe the species out. So maybe this is that in reverse. If we're really getting rabbit holey, maybe the children tried to engineer a disease and unleash it on humankind and it backfired on them. But it sounds a little too similar to what our theory about the others themselves is. But hey, grayscale, others, if that's a connection, probably not though. Anyway. Not, at least it's not as far as the children being the originators of that, because I still think that grayscale originated with the Rhoynar. Stefan B with a nice little quick connection. The white worm in one of the eyes sockets there versus the worm that Arya bites in the skull, illusionary skull of the kindly man. Guinevere Greenstones wants to know, is Bloodraven aware that Bran is warging into Hodor? That's a great question. If either he's okay with it and he doesn't see of it as an abomination like Hagen told Varamir, or he's just not aware of it. It's possible he doesn't know. Skin changers can detect other skin changers, but that doesn't mean they can detect... Actually, no, they do. We see, Varamir senses Orell and things like that. So yeah, maybe he just hasn't checked, or maybe he doesn't care. It's a great question. My guess is I guess I would lean towards he knows, but it just doesn't concern him because bigger issues.
Yeah, much bigger issues than Bran being part of some abomination.
Yeah, he might be like, wow, but he may be like, well, you're more powerful than I thought, or something like that.
A good sign.
Yeah, a good sign, not a bad sign. We can use this power. We need that. Speaking of, Summer has a pack. We noticed that there's other wolves with him, and that's the pack he took over back earlier in his arc. That was Varamir's pack. So Varamir is probably one of Summer's packlings now. So Varamir is in his second life following Summer around. I'm pretty sure that's the case. Referring again to the river you hear is swift and black and flows and down to a sunless sea. This builds on the Lord of the Rings reference that we established earlier, a slender stone bridge across an abyss. Yeah. No Balrog here that we know of, but still, there is a sunless sea in the Lord of the Rings version of that too, with the same slender stone bridge across a black abyss. Perhaps that they flee over. Tree Girl says it's also underworld imagery, right? It's very much like the timelessness, the death imagery. Yeah, it's like afterlife almost. And if Bran leaves it to return to the world of the living, oh, that's interesting. And it touches on what you guys were just talking about with Jon and Ghost, because Jon is also going to go to the underworld, in a sense, in Ghost's body, and then return to the world of the living. So that is a brilliant parallel. Regarding Beric Dondarrion, Sophia says, if your essence is scattered like dust, the way it's portrayed, like when Varamir dies, that's how it's sort of spelled out for us. Like his essence is going amongst the trees and rocks and roots and everything. It's just sprinkled and scattered everywhere. So if you're resurrected, all those little tiny dust motes and dots and all those little tiny specks, that's really all pulled together back into you. She says, no wonder some of you is lost upon resurrection. The idea that every single little iota of your being can be recovered seems like maybe not every little bit. And that's why memories are lost, why some of the original living version is gone. Really good take there. Both Rolling Knight and Nina noticed the reference to Samuel Coleridge Taylor's Kubla Khan. Again, this is the Sunless Sea. The line from that poem is, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. George has definitely read that. So I think that's probably where the inspiration comes from. Again, down here, there was no wind, no snow, no ice, no dead things reaching out to grab you, only dreams and rushlight and the kisses of the ravens and the whisperer in darkness. That is a direct reference to H.P. Lovecraft. There's a story called The Whisperer in Darkness. In that story, there's a man heading into some hills in search of legends, of monsters and small people. There's a black stone with runes on it. There's a dude whose body is basically dead, but he's given great powers by an elder race. Not exactly a direct connection, but you can see a lot of these familiar story beats. Otherwise, the story is pretty different, but that's got some similarities for sure. In that story are mentioned a variety of ancient gods, one of whom is called Bran. Lovecraft meant that as a reference to Bran Mac Morn, last king of the Picts. The fictional Picts, not the real Picts. This is a character invented by Robert E. Howard, as in the creator of Conan. Yes, Bran Mac Morn, created by Robert E. Howard. Archmaester Emma says that line, time ran its iron circles, is that a reference to Wheel of Time? Quite possibly. George is a fan of the Wheel of Time series, a bit of a contemporary series to A Song of Ice and Fire. Wheel of Time started not too long before Game of Thrones did. Dichotomy of the place being timeless. When Bran is given the weirwood paste, he's told it's time. So that's kind of a neat juxtaposition of everything being timeless, but when it's time for him to drink the weirwood paste, they're like, it's time. This is just really neat how it steps out of its own pattern there to mark something so important, as if it's so important that it does deserve a milestone even amidst the timelessness. And finally, we have further setup for mists later in the book, especially Theon's chapter today, because the mist is described several times here. It's meant, I think, to be a symbolic connection to Bran or Bloodraven or both, if not green seers in general, was one suggestion I saw, which makes a lot of sense. And that's that. Bran 3, one of the biggest, most important chapters. I hope we did it justice. We certainly spent a good amount of time on it. And now Jon 7, Return to the Grove of Nine, a.k.a. The Gang Meets 1-1. A lot of irony in this chapter. It's a shorter one, but has a heavy dose of George playing with expectations that turn out to be kind of funny in a wry sort of way, or ironic, or both. As usual, a good portion of that is missed the first time through, though. So a lot of this is something you catch this time, or the second time, third time, whatever this is for you. For example, Jon ponders what to do with the new Magnar of Thenn, Sigorn, who hates Jon since he killed his father's steer back in A Storm of Swords. So Jon's not sure he can trust Sigorn with a castle, but he will later marry Alice Karstark, i.e. one of the fake Aryas, and become Lord of Karhold. So that's a much more powerful castle than any of the ruins Jon might have given him. So it's kind of, but it seems to work out, at least so far. Obviously, we're not that deep into the Alice and Sigorn at Karhold plotline just yet. So remember last time we started with the first line of the chapter was the moon, blank, blank. And this time we have this.
The sun had broken through near midday after 7 days of dark skies and snow flumes. Oh, whoops. And snow flurries.
What did you say, flurries?
No, I said snow flumes. And I'm
Snow
like, I don't know what a
flumes.
flume is in that respect. Like, I know what a flume is, but all right.
Pretty good. I think that works. Snow flume, yeah, it works. After the previous chapter stuck deep down beneath Earth, Jon 7 starts with a definitive reminder that we're above ground, checking the weather, looking at the sky. It's like, look at a heavy dose of sky here to balance all that out. And the weather is notable too, not just because the sun has broken through, nor because there's been 7 days of flurries. That seems fairly normal. After all, winter's coming and we're at the wall. But soon enough, south of here, Stannis' army is going to be snowed in directly, and so will nearby Winterfell. But the snow up here at the wall won't be nearly as bad. So, that's not strange. Like, it snows. Just because it's snowing doesn't mean it must be snowing more to the north, wherever you are. That's not how weather systems work. But it is still notable. And the signs of winter are everywhere, despite it not being so bad, despite this, even during this respite, because it's the first day without snow and he sees no hint of free folk. That means it's time to go to the old Weirwood. It's the place he took his vows to join the Night's Watch when it became truly final, i.e. when his oath was offered, as in he was told he was going to be a steward, but he hadn't actually taken his vows. They're like, okay, now's the point of no return. If you take your vows, you are a brother for life. If you want to quit, now's your chance. Sam was there, of course, having chosen to say his prayers instead of giving them to the Seven. In what is perhaps an allusion to cold hands, all the Rangers wrap scarves around their faces to obscure their features. Well, that's not the reason they do it, it's to stay warm. But Jon thinks he still knows who each one of them is. That's neat. And that's a really important thing. It's very symbolic of Jon getting to know his men really well and of how important he sees that. They're not just faceless members of a military order. They're individuals, each of whom deserves to live, each of whom deserves to be treated within a certain range of fair ways. So that's really cool. And he has one of his, for lack of a better word, ghost moments where he's ghost for just a split second. It's involuntary almost, or if it's voluntary, it's nothing conscious, which I guess means it is involuntary. It's so brief here that he's not even sure it happened, but we are. Quote.
Jon smelled Tom Barleycorn before he saw him, or was it Ghost who smelled him? Of late, Jon Snow sometimes felt as if he and the direwolf were one, even awake. The great white wolf appeared first, shaking off the snow. A few moments later, Tom was there.
It seems clear to us, though. I mean, yeah, Jon's sense of smell can't be that good, right? How's he supposed to smell Tom Barleycorn? I mean, it's highly dubious he could smell anyone other than like reek from a distance outside. Like he can't even see this person. So yeah, but he can smell him. Like that is not a human sense of smell, I don't think. So yeah, that's Ghost right there. So he has a similar moment too when he's praying and hugging Ghost. Like Ghost gets all close and like snuggles up. It's very nice. But he smells the giant and he hears his own heartbeat. Like again, that's not his own senses. That is Ghost. These moments are surely about his vision for cultural cohesion in the face of the others too, right? He is trying to build a coalition despite this resistance from his brothers, especially the other officers. He's got a plan. He sees the wildlings, the free folk, as people who will help, who see the common enemy, who have experience against them. Why make an enemy of them when they are willing to fight the same common enemy? It's also groundwork for his wolf time, aka his death, aka second life, because through the wolf, he looks at everybody and sees them as just people. And this is going to be mirrored in our first chapter next week, which is The Watcher. And that's Areo Hota's chapter when he talks about Doran Martell, that is, talks about Daenerys, not Daenerys Targaryen in Meereen, but Daenerys Targaryen, wife of Meryn Martell, the one who had the water gardens built for her, who when she says, she had this revelation that when all the kids are naked in the pool, she can't tell who's who, she can't tell who's highborn or what, they're all just children. This is a very similar moment here for Jon. So there's 10 Rangers, including Jon, 6 recruits taking the black who are new. So there's 17 of them total. Most notable are Leathers and Jax, who are free folk older than 40. So these aren't just young, these are young, not young guys. Like Jon thinks how they both have sons and grandsons and presumably daughters and granddaughters. Jon offered to let them fight alongside the brothers, not actually take the black, but he also said, if you want to take the black, you can. These are the first 2 to do that. So that's very meaningful. Leathers, in particular, of the 2, rises fast, partly because he's really good. He's a good warrior. And also because there's not exactly a lot of other candidates for officers. And also because Jon is sending other people he trusts away. And, well, he wants to have free folk be part of the leadership structure to give them more legitimacy, to show the other free folk that it is possible to rise within the watch, to show that they're being trusted and given responsibility and power. Yeah, I mean, Leathers is going to be named Master at Arms next chapter. And this chapter, he is very valuable in terms of translating what old one is saying and speaking to him and kind of talking him down. It's important to swear these vows too, right? Vows are important in the North, and weirwood trees matter. A message Joe writes has never been clearer than right now after we just saw Bran 3, something that we just didn't grasp the first time we were at this grove in Game of Thrones, Book 1. Like, we had no idea all this backstory, all this darkness, all this hope behind the weirwoods, and all, there's just so much to it. And Bowen Marsh was there the first time. He was all about it. He was like, yeah, say your vows at the heart trees. That's what you want to do. But now things are different because the Weeper's out there. He's worried about what the free folk will do. He says this is not an important risk. It's a reasonable argument, right? I mean, Bowen's not a bad guy, even though we know what's coming. He disagrees with Jon's decision here. Yet, he's loyal to the Watch. If he wanted Jon dead, he wouldn't warn him again. He'd be like, yeah, go ahead, get yourself killed. So he's loyal to the office. He's not against Jon Snow, the Lord Commander. He's against this decision by the Lord Commander. And that's a very important distinction. But back to the Grove of Nine itself. Let's get this really nice quote out there.
The weirwoods rose in a circle around the edges of the clearing. There were 9, all roughly of the same age and size. Each one had a face carved into it, and no two faces were alike. Some were smiling, some were screaming, some were shouting at him. In the deepening glow, their eyes looked black, but in daylight they would be blood red, Jon knew. Eyes like ghosts.
It's a much different effect than when we saw this grove the first time, like I said. So we know that maybe even Bran is watching or something like that. What a queer thought that is, to think, ooh, yeah, he says eyes like ghosts, and ghost is blood and bone the same way, and Jon himself might be looking through those eyes next book. And we don't know what's going through the minds of the men who are kneeling this time, giving their vows, but we can be pretty sure it's more earnest than Ramsay and poor Jane 2 chapters from now, who will also be kneeling before Weirwood, giving not so honest vows. Here's some interesting writing from George, a little onomatopoeia, I think is the right term. Satin's voice was sweet as song, horses hoarse and halting, Aaron's a nervous squeak. The recruits promised to be the shield for all mankind, and that hits Jon hard. That's what it comes down to. Again, they are individuals. Yes, they're brothers in black, but it's a very emotional moment for him. And that's when we get some of Jon's skin changing, kind of subconscious skin changing there, as he feels that closeness to the old gods, his closeness to this duty. It's very almost serene for him, despite all the, expectation of violence and death that's coming. Some of the rumor mill theme is shown here in reverse, right? We hear about all the stories told about Daenerys from far away. We hear all these stories about giants that's going to show up. We're going to start hearing that pretty soon, starting next chapter, as the other Night's Watchmen are like, giants eat people. I'm like, not this one. If any of them do, I don't think any of them do. This one certainly doesn't. So the rumor mill that's something that needs to get broken down. The wildlings believe a lot of false things about the brothers. In this case, they hear that because Mance was burned, everyone was burned. Like, they weren't actually accepting the surrenders. It was just a trick. That's what they believe. So they get talked out of that, and good thing, because we know that's a lie. Only Mance was burned, and it wasn't actually Mance. So, yeah. Now, 1-1. Here's something important about this. The way he is, the symbology behind the language and how he's written. Notice the long ago phrase that Jorman woke giants from the earth. He blew his horn, and how giants are associated with things like that, earthquakes and the shaking and things like that. The language is, when he stirred, it was as if a boulder had come to life. And his weapon is a giant maul, which is just a tree, 6-foot-long shaft of tree with a stone lashed to the end of it. And it says the shaft of it was 6 feet of gnarled oak, the head of stone as big a loaf of bread. The impact made the ground shake. So yeah, all this, like, the earthquake metaphors are really strong here. Interesting too is that he's bigger than Mag the Mighty. He isn't necessarily a stronger personality. We don't really know about that. He seems kind of childlike, actually. He hits snow off of branches. Picture, if you haven't read this far ahead, or if you've forgotten about it, when he meets Patchface, he just laughs. He's just like, haha, that's hilarious, So he does have this childlike aspect to him. George probably is fond of him. After all, as we've stated in the past, the Giants are often a way for George to reference his favorite football team, the Giants, the New York Giants. And I believe I mentioned last time that the name 1-1 is a reference to the number 11, 1-1, which was the number of Phil Simms, who was a quarterback for the Giants when they won the Super Bowl. In fact, it was the year that they broke Treyarch Belichow's unbeaten string of victories. And again, just like the music of the children and the implication that harmony and singing brings people together, we have that here. Leathers speaks to 1-1, and Jon notes that the song has a music to it. Not the song, but the speech, this language, the Old Tongue. To be clear, the Giants speaking Old Tongue, the Wildlings speak Old Tongue. The children speak true tongue. That's not the same thing. The true tongue is like the sound of, it's mimicked after the sound of nature, hence things like rustling and all that. But this is gruff and guttural, but quote, with music in it. And that's super important because this song is soothing, and it creates the peace that allows them to work together, at least for a little while. Obviously, we know things are going to fall apart a bit with stupid Patrick of King's Mountain provoking 1-1, and that's too bad. It's slightly kind of reverse foreshadowed here. He tells Leathers, hey, good job talking to 1-1. Well done. You keep an eye on him. Joe says he's appointed the Castle Black's first official giant liaison officer and says, don't let anyone provoke him. Now, that's a tall order, pun intended, but he's unable to stop it because, yeah, as I said, Patrick of King's Mountain does more than provoke him. He stabs him, and next thing you know, Jon is stabbed also. Of course, those two things happen like right at the same time. Very small detail here that I didn't catch. Joe caught this. Really good catch. Leathers, when he accepts this, when he acknowledges Jon's order, he says, send some food or whatever. And he says, it says there's a brief pause, and Leathers says, my lord. It's almost like it casts your mind maybe to the conversation between Roose and Ramsay, or Roose and Theon about saying my lord or my lord. But that's not really what's happening. This is a free folk man saying my lord to a commander of the Night's Watch. Talk about maybe something this might be the first time this has happened in hundreds of thousands of years. It might be the first time it's happened ever. A former warrior of the free folk joining the Night's Watch and referring to his commander as my lord. That's why there was the pause, because he's like, boy, this feels weird. I've never called someone lord before like this. Not like this. Not like, well, they're actually sworn and they swore to obey. Free folk don't do that, right? They're like, yeah, I'll be in your raiding party, but if I want to leave, I'm leaving. There's none of that here. This is a commitment. And so it's a very different thing. And that's a big deal for someone who's in their 40s that already has kids and grandkids, right? He's not often are the older ones the ones that make the change. Often they're the stubborn ones. Not always, for sure. Last time they went to the Grove of Nine, they brought back 2 corpses. Actually, let me back up a second. This is the best argument that Jon will have for why bringing wildlings into the Watch is a good idea. Because of stuff like this. Like, there would have been blood. If they fought 1-1, Jon thinks to himself, we would have won, but it would have been costly. We would have lost some men. Instead of a bloody mess, they have someone new on their side that can do the work of 12 men. Of course, the big problem is the men are terrified of him and they don't accept it. But on paper, you can see why Jon thinks this might work out really well. And while the alternative is clearly worse, fighting them, well, what good is that? What good does that do? So yeah, last time they went to the Grove, they brought back 2 corpses. Interestingly, same here. The last time those 2 rose in the night and killed Sir Jeremy Riker and almost killed Lord Commander Mormont. This time they're ready for that. So they're not like, oops, those 2 rose also? No, Jon wants to learn. He's curious. He's like, maybe they'll rise. Maybe we can ask them questions. We can learn about our foe. It makes sense. Learn your enemy. Know thine enemy, right? It makes sense. And it's kind of dark too, because he's actually learning about what he's about to be. He's like, what's it like to be undead? Well, Jon, soon you'll be able to tell us firsthand. Although if he's raised by Melisandre, that's going to be different than if you're raised by the others. So there's still going to be differences. Now, this is why this is getting into Night King stuff. And I don't mean TV Night King. I mean the 13th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch eons ago that supposedly dabbled in the dark arts. You can see why Jon wanting to experiment on the whites through the rumor mill might come out as Jon is dabbling in the dark arts. Same way we see Dany described as, killing all her family members and drinking the blood of things. Like, she didn't do anything like that, but she did eat a horse's heart, and her brother did die while she was watching, but he provoked her, he provoked Khal Drogo. So it's all this same rumor mill business back and forth. We see the free folks' view of the brothers. We see the brothers' view of the free folk and of giants. We see Dany's view of the slavers' view of Dany. All this back and forth, and everyone's filtered through their own perspectives here. And it's really important to keep track of all that, because what one character thinks of another is entirely different, and their perspective on why is different as well. So this looks like necromancy. This looks like, and if Jon is getting close to Melisandre, right? If he's friendly with her and spending time with her and talking to her, you get into the same Night King legend where, the story is that he saw her from afar and fell in love with her, and they did sacrifices and all this other stuff. So if she brings him back from the dead and they have this connection, especially if it's the kiss of life and it looks, that goes into the rumor mill. Anyway, you can see how all this would develop. Moving on, Jon gets another letter. He takes careful note of the color of the wax, foreshadowing the pink letter, probably setting up that, building the meaningfulness of the wax color and what it tells you. Stannis tells of his success at Deepwood Motte, says he's going to march on Winterfell, where Ramsay and Arya are going to be wed, says he has 5,000 troops now, which is a huge improvement. He only had 1,500 when he sailed north. First-time readers can note Arnold Karstark's pending betrayal and worry about Stannis, especially ones who had seen the TV show and expect Stannis to lose to the Boltons. But I don't think Stannis is going to lose to the Boltons in the books. And especially because we know through Theon's Winds of Winter chapter, Arnulf and grandsons and sons are not only discovered, but they're already locked up. They're already in prison. And he has Arnulf's maester, who is the Dreadfort maester, who had ravens trained to fly to Winterfell. In that letter, or in this letter here, rather, that Stannis sends to Jon, he says, among the men he has in his army are people who fought in the army that Ramsay attacked outside of Winterfell. Men who were with the Kerwins and Sir Roderick and Hornwoods. So these are people who really hate Ramsay and know what he did. So these are important witnesses. And that's also important for the Kerwins because young Lord Kerwin was killed in that same sneak attack alongside Sir Roderick. And there's Kerwins and Hornwoods in Stannis' army. So Stannis quite possibly knows more than he's letting on here about what really happened at Winterfell. And that is fodder for a less popular but possible interpretation of the pink letter, which is that Stannis sent it. As a way to trick Jon into sending his army south to give him more troops to help fight Roose Bolton with. There's a lot of problems with that theory, but not so many that it can be discarded. But we'll talk about that when we actually get to the pink letter. Either way, Stannis knows what really happened at Winterfell. He has witnesses to Ramsay being the one who destroyed it and not Theon being the one who destroyed it. We also hear that Alysanne Mormont dealt with Asha's ships by hiding her men in fishing ships, which is what Victarion is going to do to Meereen on a much larger scale. So that's kind of little of back and forth there. So it looks like Asha was not going to get to her ships regardless. If she had fought her way through the forest, if she had somehow escaped Stannis' men, she would have gotten to her ships to find them not there anymore. So to Jon, it's good that Stannis is succeeding, but the Arya news is confusing, right? Because he just was told by Melisandre that she's fleeing north. So it's like, how's that possible? He has some really comic relief-ish thoughts almost. Quote,
could his sister truly have escaped such captors? How would she do that? Arya was always quick and clever, but in the end, she's just a little girl. And Roose Bolton is not the sort who would be careless with a prize of such great worth.
Wow. Okay. So one day Jon is going to see what this little girl is capable of, and he's going to eat his words. And the subtext, too, is notably placed given that we just had the children of the forest who are also little and not to be despised, and not to be, we don't want to take them too lightly. Certainly more dangerous than their size indicates. Also, of course, Roose Bolton did have Arya in his possession at Harrenhal. I just never realized it. So, and of course, if he's being careless with the prize of such great worth, well, he doesn't actually have her. So is it really that? Maybe he would be careless with a fake Arya, and of course it's Ramsay who loses her, not Roose. So anyway. So Jon is asking himself, is Stannis wrong that Arya's at Winterfell, or is Melisandre wrong? Either way, the answer doesn't make sense to him because he didn't consider that there's two fake Aryas. That option didn't occur to him. But it did occur to him that it's a fake. He just didn't think of two fakes. So the idea that Roose Bolton is foisting a fake Arya on the North of that, he considered. He's like, is this a trap? And it is a trap. Here's the quote, in fact. Look how close he is to the truth.
What if Bolton never had his sister? This wedding could well just be some ruse to lure Stannis into a trap. Eddard Stark had never had any reason to complain of the Lord of the Dreadfort, so as far as Jon knew, but even so, he had never trusted him, with his whispery voice and his pale, pale eyes.
Yeah, I love that little wordplay. Some ruse to lure Stannis. So it is. That is exactly what it is. And it's also about laying claim to Winterfell itself, though. That's part of it. And Roose realizes there's multiple reasons to do it that way, multiple factors, all of which lead to this strategic decision. We also learn in this chapter that the 6 spearwives were freed by Ed and Jon in concert, smuggling them out of Molestown. He thinks how he respects Mance, but doesn't trust him, but also thinks that kings must do what they must. Melisandre, he still trusts less. But how's he going to feel about Melisandre if she resurrects him? But also, how's he going to feel about Melisandre when he learns it's not Arya, but Jane Poole? So there's all sorts of just surprises Jon has coming for him. And it's hard, given multiple surprises, it's pretty hard to predict how he's going to react, especially given he may be, a dead person by the time he gets a chance to react to these things. Well, he definitely will be dead by then. Jon gives some history thoughts. Love that. Love it when the narrative turns that direction. He thinks about how Winterfell has never seen a battle fought between 2 armies without Starks on either side, because the Starks have ruled Winterfell for so long. So that's a dark thought, not a pleasing thought, that so many years of Stark rule are over. That's not a good precedent. He thinks that the castle is a shell, a quote ghost of Winterfell, similar to the name Theon's going to take a few weeks from now. Then he thinks of his own history mingling with regular history. It's a great quote.
When Jon had been a boy at Winterfell, his hero had been the young dragon, the boy king who had conquered Dorne at the age of 14. Despite his bastard birth, or perhaps because of it, Jon Snow had dreamed of leading men to glory just as King Daeron had, of growing up to be a conqueror. Now, he was a man grown, and the wall was his, yet all he had were doubts. He could not even seem to conquer those.
Yeah, and interestingly, Robb, as we saw, Robb was the one who really lived out the young dragon's life, like almost to a T, even killed during a parlay type situation, wedding parlay, similar spot where you're not supposed to, use weapons. Jon too will be killed by people he trusts, or under people that he thinks he can trust at least a little bit. And well, Jon is living out more of the life of a king who had been successful rather than one who was just a conqueror and died before his conquests were all complete. Jon is trying to figure out how to rule how to rule the Wall, facing long-term issues like food and weather, like logistics, like difficult problems that aren't like glorious problems. Like conquest is glorious. Daeron, the young dragon, that was part of what he was interested in. And it's interesting too, Jon has a lot of success this chapter. He handles the situation at the Grove really well. He is putting people in the right places. He's making some good decisions. Of course, he's also sending men away. That's the thing that continues that we don't like to see, because he's not taking the successes as positive. He's taking them as his duty, whereas his doubts he is beating himself up with. So he's not praising his successes. He's not giving himself credit for when he does well, but he is beating himself up when he does badly. And that can wear on you. And this is part of why he's so hardcore about killing the boy and sending his friends away. He's still on that trip. As Joe writes, he's still killing the boy far more than the boy needs to be killed, sending Emmett away. Yes, he can trust Emmett, which is why he's sending him away, but Emmett at his side is fearsome. Emmett's the guy who threw down Janos Slynt. Like, people are a lot less likely to step to Jon with Emmett at his side. And Ed Tollett too. You know, people joke about Ed, but he's no slouch when it comes to, weapons. So it's too bad that Jon is so serious about this that he doesn't give himself a little more self-care. Doesn't realize the importance of that. He's just pushing and pushing and pushing. But you appreciate some of his long-term planning at the same time, despite the manpower planning having some issues. He's still got a lot of good ideas that you could see working if he can just get certain things in line. For example, he doesn't have the money for the glass gardens. He wants to build indoor greenhouse type situations like they have at Winterfell. He's using Winterfell as model for things that could be done at the wall. He doesn't have the money for it, though. However, the money will appear later. And it's a good thing when Tycho Nestoris shows up, he's like, well, I already have plans for what I would do if I had money. He was prepared for, I had a list of what we need and in priority. So that's pretty cool. Good leadership by Jon. So as much as we can criticize some of Jon's seeming recklessness, like I agree with Bowen Marsh that Jon doesn't explain himself very well and he comes off as rash, and that's scary if you're a sub commander and your leader is someone who you think is not very cautious, someone you think takes risks that aren't necessary. Meanwhile, we have a very rare moment of good boy. I mean, Ghost is always a good boy, but he's actually acting like a dog here. He's rolling around in the snow. It's a really nice kind of moment of relief, I suppose. So Jon sends all the spear wives to their own castle because he doesn't. It's causing too much problem having to protect the women from the men. He thinks, well, if we put guards on them, then who's going to guard the guards? Better to just send them off. And ironically, Emmett is one of the ones he trusts and sends them away. One of them is going to develop a relationship with Emmett. So it's maybe not a problematic relationship, but it is technically, a breaking of his vows. And this is probably not what Jon expected. That said, I'm not complaining. It's just a neat note. I would go into detail on these different castles, but rather than doing that, I'm going to plug Joe Buckley's book, Castles of Westeros. He does a very thorough job covering a lot of these castles, and the Night's Watch castles are included there. So just to mention real quickly that Longbarrow is the one where the women are being sent to. So if you want a description of Longbarrow, Sable Hall, or the very beautiful Deep Lake, grab a copy of Joe's book, Castles of Westeros. It's on Amazon. You can also find it. I believe there's a link on our website. A lot of ways to find it. Title is pretty straightforward. Great Castles of Westeros. Nice little bit of parallel storytelling noticed by Nina. The note about 7 days of dark skies and snow flurries followed by sunlight reminds us of the Pink Letter, which Ramsay's going to say 7 days of battle, meaning this might be a hint about that, because that part of the Pink Letter has always been questionable. It's like 7 days of battle. Wait, what does he mean by that? Like, it's just kind of odd. Like, the campaign was 7 days long. They didn't fight for 7 straight days. That's absurd. But they may have had 7 days of skirmishes of, maybe the whole engagement took that long off and on. I don't know. But that is peculiar. I like Jon's caution here. As much as Bowen sees him as reckless, he actually is very cautious. He sends scouts out. He's got Ghost for scouting too, which is really valuable. And that's, he says that's something that Benjen and Blackjack Bulwer didn't have. And he's right. Ghost is an amazing scout. So that is really, really valuable. But it does, like I said, it reminds me of Jaime in his extreme caution of sending out guards and all that. I imagine he got that from Ned. Note too that Stannis is still kind of treating Jon like a vassal. You and your brothers must hold the wall until I can return. I'll try to free your sister and all these other things. It just sounds, he just really still speaking to him like he's a subordinate. And Jon can't really do much about that. It's like, well, I don't want to make Stannis mad at us. Better him than Bolton. Another cannibalism metaphor comes. Stannis was a deliberate commander, and his host was a half-digested stew of clansmen, Southron knights, kingsmen, and queensmen, salted with a few northern lords. So it's very much a food metaphor for the army, perhaps meant to foreshadow that there's going to be actual cannibalism amongst those dudes. Although it won't be the clansmen that are half digested. It'll be some of the some of the king's men, I guess. One of Jon's men is Big Little, elder brother of Middle Little. And it's interesting that he's the elder brother. Why did he join the Watch when he was presumably the heir to the Little lands? And that is perhaps an in-joke with George because he named this guy Duncan. And Duncan, the small, a.k.a. firstborn son of Aegon the Unworthy, also forsake his inheritance, but not for the wall, for a woman. So still, either way, it's kind of maybe that's what's being referred to here. Sophia notes the nice parallel of the trees, the grove of 9 described as white-cloaked trees, and we have the black-cloak brothers amidst them. That's pretty cool dichotomy. And that's that for Jon 7. It's, like I said, a short chapter, a very focused chapter on just a few things, important things, but it doesn't have nearly as many rabbit holes, especially compared to Bran 3. All right, let's go to Daenerys 6, a cloak of 1,000 flies, a.k.a. a Tokar of 1,000 lies. Not a lot of preamble for this one. I'm just going to say that, fittingly enough, another first line that calls on our basic senses to set the tone. Here it is.
The stench of the camp was so appalling, it was all that Dany could do not to gag.
Like Jon, she heads a short distance and brings mercy to some people in terrible shape. A lot more than Jon helped, and in Jon's case, there was no disease, but still, similar theme, and them going directly, facing the danger head on, rather than letting subordinates do it. Significant similarity as well. If you've been with us the entire book, you've probably noticed how often we've pointed out the Dany-Jon themes crossing over. So, Anina thinks it's no coincidence that this chapter comes on the heels of Jon 7, where we get to see some of these very direct comparisons. Not even a chapter or two in between. So we notice the connection perhaps more distinctly. The flux has gotten worse. Terrible descriptions like that 1,000 flies bit that I'm referring to in the opening title. It's because Dany sees a man covered in flies, and at first she thinks it's a cloak. And in the case of the Tokar, well, there's so much dishonesty wrapped around this marriage, wrapped around the associations and all the traditions. And a little of it's on her side, too. Mostly it's on their side, though. So she's kind of like Jon, having Bowen Marsh say, why are you doing this? This risk isn't worth it. There's a whole group of people telling Dany not to do this. It's much more people. The scale is larger here, of course. More advisors saying don't do that. More people in desperation. More danger for her, quite possibly. On the other hand, there's a reason to think that maybe it isn't quite so dangerous. She recalls some lessons from Viserys, her brother, who told her that their family has immunity to disease. Well, this is not entirely true. It's partly true. So we shouldn't be surprised, though, that an exaggeration is coming from the same guy who said this.
I shall kill the usurper myself, he promised, who had never killed anyone.
You remember that line?
Also, I have Xerxes all going crazy over here.
Look at him blocking the screens.
Yeah, I keep pushing him. He blocks the other screen.
So yeah, surprise, surprise, Viserys was exaggerating. So here's what the plague business means, though. There's lots of examples of Targaryens dying during plagues. The Shivers killed another Daenerys. The Great Spring Sickness killed Daeron II, Valar, and Mataris. Grayscales killed Majel. Childbed fever killed Daella. A different Daella. Daella. A burst belly killed Balon. Consumption, which is tuberculosis, got Aegon III eventually. An unspecified STD got Daeron the drunkard. An unspecified, quote, short illness got Jaehaerys II. Jaehaerys and Alysanne died in old age, but they weren't that old, so some disease got them. Alyssa never fully recovered from Aegon's birth, so some sort of maybe lingering infection, fever perhaps. Many Targaryens died in infancy, and there's plenty of Targaryens whose deaths were unclear, so there's probably a few more in there. However, Maester Gildain notes in Fire and Blood a list of diseases that no Targaryen has ever gotten, and they credit the dragon blood in burning it out. Kind of a neat metaphor. So the exaggeration was that it applies to all these diseases, and clearly these examples show us that it doesn't. But there is a list of diseases that no Targaryen has ever gotten, and that seems like pretty strong evidence. One of those diseases is the bloody flux. So Dany might indeed be immune to this. She might not be immune to other things, and in fact, she probably isn't. But this is pretty strong data that she's immune to this particular one. So if her handmaids and blood riders knew that, which there's no way they could, but if they did, they wouldn't be so worried about all this. A quick note on that. Majel did die of grayscale. That's hard to fake. Darren the Drunkard almost certainly did die of an STI, but Jaehaerys' death from a sudden illness, you never know about things like that. That could be foul play. Still, this is not a pushback against the obvious cases like I said, grayscale. Like, that's a disease. It's very straightforward. Even though she believes in her own immunity, even though that's a factor here, it's still brave going amongst the refugee population because she doesn't know that for certain. It's not proven. It's important too, regardless of the bravery aside. She feels guilt. She feels responsibility. She takes it seriously, and she understands on some level the value of walking amongst the people, showing them hope, being the symbol that they see her as, living up to their portrayal of her. As unrealistic as it is, even a little bit helps. It gives them hope. Hope is powerful, and that's about all some of these folk have at this point. It does, as we mentioned Aegon III a minute ago, and this is a similar example. He went amongst the sick during the winter fever, and many people he talked to died. Some who didn't would attribute it afterwards to his healing hand. So they believed that he helped them, even though he probably didn't logistically help in terms of fighting the virus. He may have given the hope to them, and hope can help your immune system. It's not understood to what degree, but stress hurts your immune system. Therefore, lack of stress is good because it's not impinging on your immune system. So there is some science behind this, even if it's not precise. So, and you got to appreciate, as much as Dany is, imperfect, she's absolutely taking responsibility. She, on the other hand, though, she's got a little too much pride in it. She thinks the gods have sent this pestilence to humble me, which is, it's a bit arrogant, right? It's not about you, Dany. It's about everyone here. Still, it's, this is one criticism or two criticisms amongst lots of praise, and she's setting a huge example. Her leadership group does not like any of this, but they follow her lead. They are not willing to leave her be. They are very devoted to her, and they won't abandon her even if they don't disagree with her decision and are afraid of her decision. So again, this speaks to how important she is as a symbol and her grasping that. Sad to say, though, if we're looking at the real world, the truth is she's helping a lot of these people bathe in ocean water. That's bad for you. Bathing in ocean water when you're already sick is not good for you unless you wash it off after. If you wash it off after, it is good for you. But they're not doing that. It changes your bacteria on your skin to things you're not used to. Yeah, it's not good for you. Like I said, unless you wash it off. Barristan himself speaks from experience with regards to the bloody flux. He says he's seen it, and it sounds like he's maybe even seen it multiple times. I don't know when he's seen it. It's not clear what engagement he's seen it in. It may be not even an engagement. Maybe he's just seen, an army drawn up to practice where an outbreak happens. But he may have seen it on the Stepstones, because the Stepstones was a nasty war that had a lot of sicknesses, because there's a lot of isolated groups of men on all these different small islands with communication being poor, and the commanders don't always know where all the soldiers are. Lots of opportunity for sicknesses like that. The bloody flux is not specifically mentioned, though. So I just remember that. I'm just guessing. So, yeah, so this is really difficult because she wants to feed them, but that means going amongst them. Going amongst them with food is dangerous because they're so starving that they attack. They're desperate. And if you get soldiers involved to keep them back from doing that, well, then your soldiers might get infected. And Barristan was smart to say, no, Dany, please do not let your Unsullied get amongst all this. That's just too dangerous. There's only so much they can do. And we wonder, too, Nina has a good take as far as theories and what this might speak to going forward. Is this going to happen in Westeros? Something like this? Seeing refugees, seeing destruction of a big city, making 10,000 Aroas in Westeros, that could really happen. Especially if Dany destroys King's Landing, sets off wildfire caches, there may be disease happening as well. We could see some very similar things. She may be a little bit inured to this. So negotiations over the marriage. Handmade cake? No. Wash his feet? No. Naked inspection? No. Fringed pearl dress? Willing compromise, but still awkward, because even that's like a symbol of fertility, which he's like, well, I'm not going to sit here and be a baby factory. That is not what I'm about, even though that's what these traditions are about. It's very much like, you are the husband's handmaid. You are here to make children. She's like, no. But also she can't. She's like, I don't think I can have children. I wouldn't be up for that anyway. But like, this is kind of a lie because I may be infertile. So it's just all very awkward for her. But she's really not about this becoming a second fiddle to her husband when she's the queen. So she's like, definitely not going to agree to these things. But some of it feels kind of like good cop, bad cop, like where they're putting all these traditions on her that they legitimately probably want to happen, but they also probably understand she's never going to agree to these things. So it's kind of like asking for something they know they can later concede so that it shows that they're willing to negotiate. Because the real thing they want is the return of slavery. Of course, that's the thing that matters more to them than almost anything else as a whole. Individually, there's goals that certain operators have, like Hisdar very much wants to be king here. He cares about that probably as much as slavery. Whereas some of the other, operators amidst the Sons of the Harpy don't care about Hisdar being king so much, as long as they have someone be king, as long as they have someone to check Dany's power and all that. So she agrees to some of these rights, but with modifications that make them less demeaning, that make them removing some of the misogyny from it. And Hisdar, like I said, with the good cop, bad cop attitude, he scoffed. He's like, yeah, those rituals, they're so old and tired. Yeah, it's good that we're changing those. And so that just speaks to me like this was maybe planned, like they or at least they knew it was kind of an unspoken arrangement that Hisdar would take her side to kind of get in her good graces. Haha. And again, this speaks to just him having his own goal. He wants to be king on top of all this. So we have the flip of Brown Ben confirmed when Daario shows up. Daario shows up and interrupts the dinner with Hisdar, and this is going to come back later. Hisdar acts like he's not bothered, but later we're going to see that he is kind of bothered by it. He vents to Barristan about that, how he really did not appreciate Dario's presence, like in general. Part of his pride speaking. I kind of don't blame him for that, whereas I blame him for pretty much everything else. But the pain of Dany's pain really comes out throughout all this, and that the Yunkai, the Astapori, the Myronese were using it against her. We already saw that with them taking advantage of her compassion by forcing the refugees north. But here, you can see how much she's suffering because she really wanted to save those people, and here she has to say, close the gates. Will you make me say it thrice? Because she knows she's locking out these people who are suffering. She so wanted to help them. Closing the gate is symbolic and final of her inability to help them, that she has to turn her back on them, despite how much hope they had placed in her. It's so heartrending for her, so heartrending for them. And it's as Joe writes, for all the mirroring with Jon's chapter, the level of pain doesn't come anywhere close. If Jon had left those 9 free folk, including one to die, he wouldn't have suffered that much over it. He's got so much else going on. But this is thousands of people that Dany had already decided were under her protection. And she has to back out of that. Ugh, very hard. Which is part of why she finally gives in to her desire with Dario, right? Everything is going wrong. She's in great pain at having to make this decision. She just hears Ben Plum has switched sides, and she legitimately liked him, so that's painful. So she's losing allies. So that's sort of another more mirroring to Jon, in that Jon is sending his friends away to do his duty because he thinks it's part of that, whereas Dany is losing them to betrayal or to circumstances. So that's kind of a looser mirroring there. There's another odd moment. Nina pointed this out before, and it's come back around again, where it's a little narrative trick. Nothing like Bran, because in Bran's chapter, it does a lot of this, but it's a little bit of a question asked, almost like a narrator, where she thinks, what kind of mother has no milk to feed her children? This is similar to Daenerys 2, when Nina pointed out the first time, when she says, what sort of mother lets her children rot in darkness, thinking of her dragons? This is the flip side to that question, because Daenerys spends much of A Dance with Dragons feeling she has to choose between being mother dragons and being Mysa, mother to those she has freed. That she can't do both because the two conflict with each other. But in both cases, it's as though the story is questioning that, whether she can do it, whether she can fulfill, whether she really even has the choice, whether she can only be the dragon. Maybe that's ultimately what it comes down to. Whether that's true or not, that's where her mind is taking her. A couple other side notes here. Rakaro has a glow up. He's larger and stronger. Ira and Jiki fighting over him a little bit. It's not just a character detail. It's not just showing the passage of time. It's a reminder of how young these characters are. Rakaro is young. Her blood rider's young. Her handmaids are young. She's young. All of that. We also get the note that Quentin's group has flipped to the Stormcrows. It's just a couple of sentences about some dudes that switch sides. We just happen to know who that is. So that's cool. That's coming soon. We'll see them talk to Dany. Missandei, very interesting note here. Missandei hears the scratching, and she thinks it's the Astapori at the walls. And they're like, what are you talking about? That couldn't have been that. That's not what it was. And they're right. It's not what it was. But she may have heard Viserion. Viserion absolutely does scratch at the bricks a lot and carves out like a hole to nest in. That's what Quentin calls it later when he sees it. He's like, that's a nest. And we just got through hearing that the children of the forest have exceptional hearing and golden eyes. Missandei has golden eyes. I'm not saying she's a child of the forest, because that's a bit much, but maybe some very ancient, distant genetic connection from long ago when everything was a Pangea, when Nath was like a...
Yeah, I think that for sure we have them described in Essos that easily Nath can have children of the forest in their background, like far, far away.
Yeah.
It makes perfect sense.
It fits super well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like just like how we see like maybe some giants bred into someone potentially, like, yeah.
Closest to nature with the butterflies. They're peaceful. Like, it just doesn't, they're so different. It's like the Crannogmen, where there's just something, there's another influence there that seems not entirely human, but also some human. So that's really neat. Maybe we'll be keeping an eye out on more details from Missandei to see what George is doing there, but it's really cool. Also, just the neat note of that the Unsullied have a goddess, the Lady of Spears, the Bride of Battle, the Mother of Hosts. Archmaester Emma writes it's similar to Hymn of Many Faces, meaning it's a truth for only those who truly belong. Because even Grey Worm is like, no, I can't really talk about this. It makes me uncomfortable to even say what I've said. And that is kind of similar, because in both cases you have the many-faced god of the House of Black and White is very much associated with violence and killing as well. A different kind. It's more of a subterfuge version than the battlefield version, but still.
I recommend if you do a search on Google for Lady of Spears Claridox, you can see his rendition of the Lady of Spears, which I think is quite well done.
Oh, cool. Yeah. Nice. Yeah, definitely. Always check out Michael Klarfeld when you get a chance. Always, at all times. No. Rolling Night reminds us of an uncomfortable thing that happened in the real world relating to something that happened in this chapter. Remember, too, that Cersei was frustrated by a variety of sexist, misogynist traditions put on queens that are not applied to kings or even non-kings, which is part of what makes the misogyny so straightforward. But here's a real-world connection. Like I said, Rolling Knight pointed out on Flick that in 1981, there was a very famous case of a royal figure whose hymen was inspected and reported on to the public. This was apparently the last time it happened in the Western world because, yeah, it's gross, it's creepy, it might be surprising, but it shouldn't be too surprising given how much misogyny is in the world, even especially within traditions that date back a long time. Who am I talking about? Princess Diana. No kidding. 1981, when she was getting married, they had a public, it was all over the newspapers, and some of y'all aren't old enough to remember how much that woman was in the news constantly. I am old enough to know that and to remember it, but I didn't know this, and it just puts a whole nother angle to how much she was in the news. Like, that was in the news? Good Lord, man. So it's not that strange to have the Milanese tradition be similar when in our own real world, this happened 40 years ago in England. Whew. Yeah. Also from Sophia, speaking of old traditions and the difference between humility and pride, Danny bathes the old dying man, but won't wash his dar's feet. It's not, it doesn't, there's nothing wrong with that because of the old dying man she's showing compassion for, she's helping. Washing his dar's feet would be submitting to him. She's not submitting to this old man. She's not like, I'm lesser than you. So it's a much different symbol, but it's a similar act with different thing behind it. So it's a good thing to make that comparison with. And that's Danny 6. Let's go on to the Prince of Winterfell, False Vows Before a Heart Tree, aka the one with Frey pies. It's incredible how many of the most memorable chapters are so close together in this book. We just had Bran's incredible final chapter, and now the continuation of the top-rated North Remembers chapter. It has fantastic character work, glorious revenge, a variety of Northern lords, some surprising twists from the past via Lady Dustin, and the supernatural is certainly at work as well. It's our first time back in Winterfell in a long time, since the end of Clash. But it also has one of the most uncomfortable passages to read in the entire series, so when I say this one is memorable, note how that word can be used in a number of ways. And here's the first line.
The hearth was caked with cold black ash, the room unheated but for candles.
One of the first details we learned about Winterfell back in Game of Thrones is how warm much of it always is, thanks to its location over hot springs, but it's also symbolic. It's a refuge in the north. It's a symbol of standing against winter for eons. By a mention of how cold this room is, no fire in the hearth. It's the opposite. Wind blowing. It shows the loss of Starks, what that means for Winterfell. The heart of Winterfell itself is gone without the Starks, and it's replaced by something heartless in the Boltons. Cold hearth. Very fitting for the Boltons. It's a perfect symbol for them. There's no guest-host relationship here of the kind that we normally think of, the kind that is built on mutual trust and compassion and understanding of the difficulties of living in the North and what exposure to the elements means. Bolton's doing all this for themselves. This isn't about protection. This is about power. This is about claiming Winterfell. This is about claiming that Stark legacy for themselves. But they don't entirely get it. And that leads us straight into our familiar colors: black, pale, blood red, flame orange, usually one or the other. The latter this time. Jane Poole's face and wedding gown are pale. Theon thinks of her as having a face carved of ice, and it's a corpse buried in snow. The flames are noted as dancing whenever the door opens. A little more on the hearths, too.
I think, by the way, we've got our next Game of Thrones color, like eyeshadow palette.
That's a good point, yeah.
Corpse.
Corpse face. Corpse white, yeah. But like for example, Catelyn's vow to Brienne that she shall always have a place by my hearth and meet at my table. Hearth is always like referred to, Be welcome at my hearth. It's just so frequently described. All the laws of the hearth, right? When it's referring to the murders of Craster is what G.R. Mormont says. So there's no welcome. There's no respect for guest right. Like I said, it's power, it's fear, it's domination. There's no love here. And it is fitting, though, that the place where there is still warmth is the Godswood, the real heart of the castle, because there is still as much as Ramsay wrecked the castle, you can't wreck the hot springs, right? That's a little more work would be required to damage those. And I don't know that it could even be done. So we wonder too if there are still actual Starks, like long dead Starks, besides Bran, in the tree, representing the true heart of Winterfell and clinging to that and hoping it comes back. And Theon is, of course, observing all these things. And I'm not simplifying by calling him Theon. The phrase written is a face carved of ice, Theon Greyjoy thought. Theon Greyjoy, not Reek. For understandable reasons, the return home to Winterfell for Jane is terrifying. For Theon, it's also somewhat terrifying, but it's also restorative. Throughout this chapter, he has a number of memories of his childhood, good ones, positive ones. Here's an important passage.
Theon Greyjoy was no stranger to this godwood. He had played here as a boy, skipping stones across the cold black pool beneath the weirwood, hiding his treasures in the bowl of a bowl. Sorry, I just didn't realize.
The same thing Jojen was in.
Thing. Yeah, just like so surprised to see bowl there again.
It's only like 8 or 12 times in the whole series that phrase that word gets used.
Okay. Hiding his treasures in the bowl of an ancient oak, stalking squirrels with a bow he made himself. Later, older, he had soaked his bruises in the hot springs after many a session in the yard with Robb and Jory and Jon Snow. In amongst these chestnuts and elms and soldier pines, he had found secret places where he could hide when he wanted to be alone. The first time he had ever kissed a girl had been here. Later, a different girl had made a man of him upon a ragged quilt in the shade of that tall, gray-green sentinel.
Think back to when he was on Pike, when he went to what he thinks of as his home. He didn't have thoughts like this. Nothing like this. If it wasn't clear before this chapter, it cements it, if you ask me. Theon wasn't born in Winterfell, but he was raised here. This is his home. He doesn't even think of it as his home. He's like, at one point he sees the ravens and is like, it's their home. What's it like to have a home? Like, man, you do kind of have a home. You weren't always 100% welcome here, but these are thoughts of home. These are childhood memories of the place you were raised. His memories of Pike are bad memories. They're not good. They may be from his childhood, but they're not. They're very bad. He hated his brothers were cruel to him. He has fond memories of the bruises he got at Winterfell because they were earned in honest training, something that was improving him, making him more of a person, making him more capable, making him more disciplined, a reason to respect him. And he was training with people who respected him and he respected them. Theon got bruises at Pike as well, but from cruelty, from being beaten on by his brothers. He didn't earn these bruises from some sort of lesson. The only lesson he got from them was that they were bad brothers, that he shouldn't trust them, that he can't count on them. And those brothers were also cruel to him verbally. He thinks his pride died down in the dungeons of the Dreadfort, that words can't hurt you once you felt a flaying knife, but he still remembers that those hurt at the time, back when he was young, when those things could hurt him. It's deeply ironic, too, because he's always wanted to be a Stark, and he's basically acting one here. He is vouching for Arya's Starkness. He is the one who gives her away in the ceremony. He's the one who walks her to the heart tree. He's the key witness to identifying her. He's literally gray and white now. He thinks to himself ruefully, well, I'm a Stark at last because of his coloring. The heart tree even talks to him. Like, this is Starkish, right? He's at Winterfell, but he's the Stark, right? No wonder he's the Prince of Winterfell, this title, because he is playing that role. After recently getting to see Eddard in this place through Bran's vision, it's definitely casting our minds back to earlier times in Winterfell, even though some of these times we never even saw. But Theon thinks about very basic boyhood stuff, losing his virginity, skipping stones on the lake, things like that. Growing up here is an honor reserved for Stark children. Yet Theon got it. He has these negative associations with it, but it's still has a lot of positive association too. And Jane is the only other person who's truly familiar with this castle. I mean, other people have been there. Like, other people who were at this ceremony have been to Winterfell before, but they didn't live there. They didn't grow up. Unless you count people watching the castle through supernatural means. Because I think Bran is present here in this chapter. So you could say he's present. He's just not physically there. Despite the familiarity Theon just expressed with the Winterfell Godswood, he describes it as unusual this time because it's gray and ghostly, filled with warm mists and floating lights and whispered voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, giving us more hint that Bloodraven and Bran are present, especially with the mists, as we just described at the end of Bran's chapter, how the mists are a clue of their presence. And here's a quote evoking that.
The way the mists threw back the shifting light made their features seem bestial, half-human, twisted. Lord Stout became a mastiff, old Lord Locke a vulture, Horsebane Umber a gargoyle, big Walder Frey a fox, little Walder a red bull, lacking only a ring for his nose. Roose Bolton's own face was a pale gray mask with 2 chips of dirty ice where his eyes should be. Above their heads, the trees were full of ravens, their feathers fluffed as they hunched on bare brown branches, staring down at the pageantry below.
So everyone is described as an animal of some kind there, except Roose, which is another way to portray that he is inhuman, soulless.
He's a vampire. We all know it, obviously.
I really do get why people think that. I don't, but I get it. They're humans in animal form, or animals in human form, but no animal can come close to representing Roose Bolton. Animals represent the natural. He is not that. Calling Ramsay a beast in human skin is, you can see that, that's fitting. He's always portrayed as uncomfortable in his own skin and clothing, despite his cockiness. He's deeply insecure, so that kind of fits the metaphor. But Roose Bolton, yeah, he's just something else. Obviously, the wedding night is the worst part. But the ceremony itself is full of chilling moments, too. Here's one just full of evil symbolism, speaking to the very thing we mentioned before of Stark falling away for Bolton.
Ramsay undid the cloak that Theon had slipped about his bride's shoulders moments before, the heavy white wool cloak bordered in gray fur, emblazoned with the direwolf of House Stark. In its place, he fastened a pink cloak, spattered with red garnets, like those upon his doublet. On its back was the flayed man of the Dreadfort, done in stiff red leather, grim and grisly.
Last week we discussed the value of House Stark as a symbol for leading the North in the worst of times, something they have accomplished so many times that people definitely take heart in that. Through endless winters, they've led the North. Wintertown itself is a sign of that goodwill, of that taking on that responsibility. Hey, y'all, come live here during the winter, close to Winterfell itself. We'll all get through this together. Where is that here? Nowhere. It's not here at all. The Boltons don't have that attitude. They don't care about that. The prime directive of guarding the North from winter has been tossed aside. The North is not united. In this case, it is less prone in general to infighting. The North is, probably because of the ever-present threat of a much more dangerous common enemy. And I don't mean the others. I mean winter. It's just the winter is worse this time because it's got the others with it. They're teaming up almost. But the long-established protection of House Stark revolves around symbolic meanings like the pack survives. But here, removed, we have the symbolic direwolf removed for the ill-fitting, as it's written there, stiff, grim, grisly red leather. It doesn't even fit proper. The garment doesn't even fit right. It's awkward and ill-made for this. Leather isn't how you stay warm in winter, rather than a gray wool fur cloak. Like even the garment itself speaks to the difference in attitude and protection here. So, uh, what does a Bolton do? The pack huddles together for warmth. That's what packs do. You all use your warmth to provide something greater. The Bolton's way is to keep oneself warm by skinning others. They're your means to protect yourself. You don't care what happens to them. They're a means to an end for yourself. So it's just over and over we're given examples of Stark generosity, Stark protectiveness versus Bolton authoritativeness, power, and greed in a number of ways. Here's another one. It's displayed very starkly, well, Boltonly, in the case of the initial return to Winterfell at the start of the chapter. Time has passed, right? But at first, Winterfell required rebuilding. Theon thinks that how when they got there, it was a ruin. It's in better shape now. What happened? They found people living there, keep taking shelter in the castle, living where they could. What does Bolton do? Is like, oh, you don't belong here. How dare you be in this castle? This is not yours. So he forces them to work to rebuild the castle, then kills them. And it's written as if he didn't, like they got mercy because he didn't flay them. Like, goodness. So we don't know how long that took, but they probably put in a lot of work. I mean, Winterfell's large, and almost every wooden structure in the entire place was destroyed. It's written later that Roose has half a year of firewood for thousands of people in the depth of winter. That's a lot of firewood. He also built the stables back twice the size they were before. So this is just a substantial building was done. So these peasants got worked hard before being murdered. It's real bad. I mean, that says it all, right? Like, those people came to the ruins because they didn't have anywhere else to live, and this is what they got. And look at this line, too, from Theon thinking a little more of Bran's presence getting notated. It felt like some strange underworld, some timeless place between the worlds. Yeah, like, he actually says strange underworld. Remember, we mentioned that as a reference to how Bran was sort of in the underworld, this timeless place of death. It's a perfect reference here. It's really awesome. And poor Jane, the moon is mentioned here. It's that same sickle moon we learned of in Bran's chapter that evokes sacrifice. And in a way, Jane is being sacrificed here. She is forced to marry this awful man, forced to pretend she's someone she isn't. And if she doesn't, her fate's even worse. Something else to take note of that's actually also creepy, but kind of cool. The heart tree has always had a solemn face, but Theon, during the ceremony, looks like he thinks it's like about to laugh. Now, it's hard to mistake a solemn face for a laughing face. So the implication that the heart tree's expression has changed is kind of like, whoa, did it really? On the other hand, Theon is very familiar with this heart tree face. So if it was a distinct change of face, he probably would have noticed that specifically. It might have freaked him out. So maybe we shouldn't read too much into that yet. I still think we should read something into it. Back to the ravens for a sec. Theon thinks it's Maester Lewin's ravens. But let's not be so sure about that. There could be other ravens there. Sure, some of them might be Lewin's ravens, but other ones could be watching. Notably, a single raven quirks during the moment of silence when when the bride and groom kneel before the heart tree face, and it's supposed to be a moment of silence. One raven breaks the silence, and I don't quite know the symbolic meaning of that, but it feels like there might be something to it. So Theon is technically a lord, so after the wedding, he's seated at the high table, but as far off to one side as possible, next to Lady Dustin. You wonder if Lady Dustin's also being sat off to the side because she's a widow, and I don't know, maybe she's just not very nice to be around, or maybe she actually wanted to speak to Theon, because they do have an interesting conversation here. It's a very interesting one, yeah. She's clearly no fool, but she was clearly fooled by Wyman Manderley. She thinks he's too scared to act. We know better. In fact, this seems to be like his last hurrah. In fact, this seems almost very brave. Like he's almost like the proverbial northern man who says he's going out to hunt in the dead of winter, when really he's just going out to die so that his family doesn't have to bear the burden of feeding him anymore when food is at such a prime is so scarce. So, but on the other hand, Lady Dustin knows not to be fully sure of her read. And, part of the reason is that Roose Bolton is wary of Wyman. And if Roose is wary of Wyman, then maybe there's a little bit else going on there. She's also wrong about Theon, though. She's like, well, he's cowardly like you. But just as Wyman is actually making quite a brave maneuver from behind the scenes here, Theon is going to make a very brave escape later on. So in both cases, she has misjudged them, or perhaps misjudges cowardice in general. Maybe she just doesn't understand how that works. She's not exactly someone who's seen a lot of battles. I mean, I don't know. So, and Theon himself doubts the idea that Wyman is a coward, and he gives a very prescient quote about Manderley here. He says, Ironborn will feast before a battle too. A last taste of life should death await. And exactly, right? This is his last hurrah. He's extremely happy. The very picture of the jolly fat man, it says. So he's actually facing his death quite bravely, considering it seems very likely to be coming. I don't know about you, but I don't know if I could be happy. I could even pretend to be happy if I knew I was going to be dead in a few weeks or what have you. So it's not good for the appetite. Yet Wyman eats 6 pieces of this pie, knowing that it's made from people. He calls for the rat cook song, which is like, wait a minute. I wonder if Roose Bolton's like, what? Wait a minute. No wonder they don't trust you. He starts naming these songs that are very suspicious, but it's also a hint that Wyman doesn't expect to survive his own revenge. As, that's kind of how the rat cook story goes. Wyman himself is not technically violating guest right, though. At least you could make a case for that. After all, it's his food, so no one served him the food. He brought the food. Second of all, is he really a guest in this castle? Is it really Ramsay's? That's not Arya. Right? He didn't actually marry the Starks. Does he have a right to this castle? So he lied to the Heart Tree with his vows. I think that's significant. We heard about what a big deal that could be. Ramsay, I don't expect to live, and I kind of expect his death to be pretty horrific. So you could argue that it's revenge of the old gods. The old gods had a hand in that, but we'll have to actually see what happens. Lady Dustin says Roose knows she could be a problem for him as well. So he takes care to keep her sweet, but we don't hear how. What exactly has Bolton promised her? What promises, favors has he already given, perhaps, if that's the case, or is it maybe little of column A, little of column B? And she does reinforce things that we kind of knew already, saying he sees everyone and everything as a game. It's really perfect. This is the Game of Thrones, after all. He sees everyone as his amusement. And, well, Roose, you're part of ours. So there. You're in the story. So Lady Dustin says he might have designs on King of the North. Well, he might decide to make himself king. And she says, why not? Considering how broken the Lannister power is, how disinterested the Tyrells would probably be, ditto just about everyone else. If he secedes, who would be able to stop him, right? And what she thinks, she sort of implies what he's waiting on is defeating Stannis. If he can defeat Stannis, he'll have leverage to crown himself, because he'll have defeated a known commodity, someone dangerous, someone powerful, someone that he can, declare some pride having done. And of course, he could count on support from the Freys continuing, because, well, that would make Walda a queen, as Lady Dustin points out. And, well, Walder Frey already wanted his daughter to be a queen of the North, so this is just another path to that. So he's almost likely to back that up. However, moving on from that, her spiel on Maesters, that's quite a turn, isn't it? I got to admit, first time I was reading this book, I definitely didn't see that coming. Just all of a sudden her bringing up the Maesters. But it does, you see why she does it. The speech from Marwyn at the end of Feast is a good example of to pair up with this about how we learn that there's way more going on behind the scenes with them. And this is indirectly related to that because, of course, there's no mention of prophecy or anything. That's what Marwyn was talking about. He was talking about supernatural and things like that. This is more about politics. And the Maesters are becoming a larger plot in general, not just Sam and Daenerys. And of course, this relates to Wyman Manderley talking about his own Maester being a Lannister and things like that. So all these family connections are starting to matter more. Lady Dustin claims it was Maester Wallace, who was born of a Hightower and an Archmaester, who pushed this Tully marriage on Rickard Stark, which is really interesting. And it was an unusual marriage. Prior to that, the only marriages that we know of Starks to the south were to one or two cases in the Vale, where it was Vale houses that had a distinct Old Gods connection, or at least some tracing to that. And of course, some Blackwood marriages, which are Old Gods. So they usually kept it when it was the South. They still had the Old Gods aspect was included in the picture there. So marrying the Tullys was a big change of pattern. It's not something that's 100% clear at the beginning of the series, even though there is data that shows it. Like, for example, Catelyn says Ned built her a sept. So there wasn't one there, which is part of the implication that they hadn't needed that before because they hadn't had these kind of marriages in the past. So it was a big change. The Starks, for example, have stayed out of a lot of the Southern engagements. Not always, of course, like the Dance of the Dragons. Cregan Stark got very involved in that. But even that, he came late because he was busy preparing his realm for winter. That took priority. And the North doesn't want to get involved with the South too often because the South is always fighting itself, which means they'd have to get involved in those fights. And we just got through saying the North prefers not to do that because their whole lifestyle is more fragile in terms of food and things like that. Fighting is a lot more likely to cause harm to both sides in the North. There's a lot more risk going to war when food is scarce and winter could smack you down. In the South, they have a lot more leeway to go to war, so they do. Another example, like the Starks, like I said, they did fight in the Dance, but they stayed out of the Blackfyre rebellions as far as we know. There is no mention of the Starks at all in any of the 5 Blackfyre rebellions, except for maybe a little bit, sending some men to help fight against Meleys. But that wasn't the Civil War. That was fighting against a foreign invader. So totally different picture. Another angle to Lady Dustin's take, though. Don't take it all at face value. She's very resentful of this marriage. She might be blaming the Maester because she wants a scapegoat. So I think there's a little of both here. I wouldn't throw away her theory, but I wouldn't fully accept it either. She wanted to marry Brandon Stark. They had a relationship. He was her first. Like pretty much all the nobles in the North, she wanted to be a Stark. Right? That's something we'll get into more next time when she goes into the crypts of Winterfell with Theon. But unlike most people in the North who wanted to marry Brandon Stark, she actually had a shot at it. And she had, the inside track in a lot of ways. To be fair, she probably overestimated her chances. She probably had some teen girl fancy about it all. Probably a little naive about what kind of man Brandon really was, because he seemed to be a womanizer. But as a young girl, the politics wouldn't have been so clear to her. These things wouldn't, she would have just been focused on what she wanted. She understands some of that now at her current age, but some of that bitterness will probably remain. And not just over that, of course. She also hates Eddard for taking the man she did end up marrying south and not bringing him back, because he died at the Tower of Joy on his personal business, is kind of how she sees it. Like, that wasn't even part of the war, man. That was just you chasing after your sister. And that just adds to her bitterness because she was only married to Lord Dustin for less than a year. So she's been a widow for most of her adult life. And this world isn't super kind to widows, even though she's a lady. She has all these privileges, but she's pretty darn lonely is something you kind of get the impression of.
It's the right decision. You become a widow, you're like, okay, I'm going to take this power. I don't need to get remarried.
Yeah, I agree.
I definitely would take her stance on things.
Yeah, it's not like she had a great other choice. You're right. Like whoever she married would take her lordship basically away and kind of rule through her. Yeah, if she somehow
fell in love with somebody, she probably would, but why else do it?
Yeah, I agree. And so it certainly suggests the Maesters were capable of steering things towards a series of marriages that would create a coalition of houses strong enough to overthrow Aerys. But why would the Maesters want to overthrow Aerys? That's a question too. Like, we hear it from Marwyn's point of view. He's saying, well, they don't want dragons to come back. They want to get rid of dragons. That's who killed them in the first place. Well, this business with Aerys, is that related to that? Aerys was terrible, but not to the Maesters that we know of. In fact, Pycelle doesn't really have complaints about Aerys that much. Pycelle lived the entire reign of Aerys without being killed. So it's not personal, right? It's not like he attacked their order. So we don't have anything simple like that to go on. But if they're, say, aware that the prince that was promised was supposedly, according to the Ghost of Highheart, who passed this on to Jaehaerys II and Shera Targaryen, she tells them that the prince that was promised would be born from their line. So let's say the Maesters hear about that. Of course they would, because this was said in court. Like, this is common knowledge. It's in the World of Ice and Fire, which was written by a Maester. So yeah, they know this. They may not believe it, but if some of them do, there's your reason for getting rid of the Targaryens. If they think that the prince that was promised, who's going to bring back the dragons as part of the prophecy, wake dragons from stone, that's in the wording. If they want to avoid that, then they want to get rid of the Targaryens. So it does fit. It's not a slam dunk. It's not for sure, but it definitely fits. But George does his thing that he likes to do, where as Lady Dustin is talking to Theon, it's getting juicier. Maybe she's going to say something else about Maester Wallace or about Rickard or about Brandon Stark or something. The old interruption trick. Roose stands up, ready to give a speech. Everyone goes quiet because, well, you gotta be real quiet to hear what Roose is saying, right? That's how that works. They will soon be at war. Another mirror to the Meereen saga. We have the same argument of stay behind the walls or meet them out in the field. And that debate happens off page because Roose says, let's not talk battle plans in the wedding hall. Let's go upstairs, chat that. Meanwhile, Ramsay, go have your wedding night. Meanwhile, from Rattlemance to Abelmance, and of course, if you missed it, Abel is an anagram for Bael the Bard, who also stole a Stark girl from Winterfell. How perfect. Of course, the original story of Bael the Bard doesn't mention 6 washerwomen, but hey, maybe Bael had some help back then too. Theon thinks they're standard camp followers and opines on the typical fate of such and their children. He seems to identify a bit with them because they're kind of wretched and don't have a lot of help in life and everybody hates them. More to the point, though, he sees even them as above him in social standing because of his crimes and weaknesses. Manderly. Let's talk about Wyman for a second. We talked about how happy he is. Of course, even though he knows he's going to die, he's also getting this revenge. Killing those 3 Freys must have been nice for him. Satisfying, perhaps, but this is even better. He's watching Roose Bolton eat people and all these other people he doesn't like, making them eat people too. Remember that part of Roose's maneuvering caused Willis Manderly to be captured by Vargo Hoat and Gregor Clegane. And what did they do to poor... Excuse me. Yeah. What did he do to poor Willis Manderly but force him to eat human flesh? So this is part of that payback. That is one of the details that I think gets thrown by the wayside. There's so many reasons for Wyman Manderly to do this, to take revenge on the Boltons and Freys, but the fact that his own son was forced to eat human flesh is a pretty darn big part of all this, because it's direct payback. It's not just what happened, but it's the thing, the actual thing that happened, the forcible eating of human flesh. So
he said, you make my son eat human flesh, I'll eat human flesh. You're human. It seems like you should be making them eat their friends as human flesh, maybe. Be more.
Well, as Lady Dustin says, Roose Bolton won't eat anything unless she sees Wyman eat it first.
Yeah,
so he kind of just has to do it.
He has to do it.
But he sure did. He sure did do it with gusto. So that's part of why, and it also presumably perhaps draws some of these other characters into eating. So specifically, as we brought up at the beginning, in the opening blurb that we start off every Valar Rereadis episode with, I mentioned the little exchange between the two Blood Riders and Simon Stripeback, where they say, "Oh, if you eat human flesh, you're cursed." And Simon Stripeback says, "Well, they were already cursed." And it's like, arguably these Boltons and Freys were already arguably cursed, but because of the things they've done, like from a karmic perspective, but also maybe from a supernatural perspective, if the old gods are, look down on what they've done. But now they've actually eaten their own kin, the Freys have. And so there's a more straightforward argument for them being cursed in the supernatural sense. And another song he calls for is "The Night That Ended." The bride will like that. He says, he's like, yeah, she's ready for all this to be over. And he's not subtle about it. He's just throwing insults out there. So when he refers to the rat cook, he's referring to Freys and the pies. When he refers to the night that ended, he's insulting Ramsay. It's also a song about the Night's Watch riding out to defeat the others in a battle for the dawn. So it's kind of neat that that's thrown in there as another mention. With the reference to Arbor Gold, he's throwing more lies. With detail, we detail all this in our episode called "Lies in Arbor Gold." There's a very distinct pattern with Arbor Gold and dishonesty and deception. So check that out if you haven't already. And then he mentions brave Danny Flint. That's a very tragic story. It's the one about the girl who pretends to be a boy to join the Night's Watch, only to be raped and murdered when found out. The title shows respect for her courage, but there's no hint that the people that did that to her were punished or anything, which is pretty dark. And well, this is also some dark wish fulfillment, vaguely related to that. Back in A Game of Thrones, Jane Poole wanted to marry Beric Dondarrion. Sansa thought that was silly, that she was acting above her station. There's no way a steward's daughter would ever marry, someone that high born. But here she is marrying, careful what you wish for. She's, not only is she marrying up, but not marrying up, in real terms, just by cultural standings. But she has to pretend to be this girl that she always used to make fun of. So it's this really, really awful present, in quotes, for Jane, a shocking revelation from Theon as well, that during this end of the chapter, which is so terrible, that Ramsay removed his penis. This is basically when we learn that. It's been hinted at before, but this is when it becomes kind of clear. So on reread, you've known that for a while, but you may not have known it until this chapter before. You may not have even realized it here. It's still kind of subtle. We're reminded uncomfortably that Jane was trained at Littlefinger's brothel. Oh man, she was whipped. She has scars on her back, which is pretty hard. But also it speaks to the same concept of how, what do people deserve here? Right? You wonder, what does Theon deserve? Like, Theon has done awful things, but we've been through this. Like, he doesn't deserve the treatment he actually got. Same going for Jane. Like, Jane didn't do anything nearly as bad as, not even close. All she did was make fun of Arya's looks. It was really early in the series, so it's an early impression, and, it's an easy thing to hate. Like, you don't think she deserves death, let alone torture. But it puts her on it put her on our bad side, right? Like this kind of petty, privileged girl making fun of someone's looks. Like, you don't like that, and there isn't anything to balance it out. Jane doesn't do things that you're like, oh, she's actually a decent person. Besides that, she's just a kid. So we were never really given any other impression of her until we were given a reason to feel really bad for her because she's going through all this. And that really gets at us. Like, in the same way, like, we know we have to revise our initial instinct and think, were we too hard on her to begin with? Did I wish bad things on her for something actually that is pretty petty? Like, after all,
I doubt you wished bad things on her in the first place.
Nothing like this.
Yeah.
But it puts it in perspective, you
Whereas
know.
me reading it, like, I was not one of the people that ever disliked Sansa, for example.
Sure.
It's like, she's a little girl.
Yeah.
Like, we're like that. That's like, some of us are bratty. So I never would have ever thought anything negative about Jane, to be honest, even when she was being mean.
Okay. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think that's good. That's
Like, Arya was mean too. She calls people stupid.
yeah, that's good. That's sophisticated of you. But I feel like some people probably maybe you know, maybe even I don't remember what I read because I read it so long ago. But yeah, it's a good point. Not everyone is going to have reacted that way. It is more about Theon. It's more of a microcosm of Theon's story in that sense, where we think about whether he deserved this or not. So it's a much easier answer with Jane. The answer is clearly no. She didn't deserve anything like this. But this perspective has all come back around again. It's interesting.
Real quick, I guess
Sure.
my question would be, do we have many like moments of Jane being mean to Theon, or Theon being dismissive of Jane?
Neither, I don't think.
Yeah, anyway, it was just
Yeah,
a question of whether she was nice to him or thought maybe he was possible for her to marry, you know.
Well, she's nice to him here, of course, but
Yeah.
prior to that, I don't know that we've had a lot of. I can't recall many interactions between them. If they've spoken about it, yeah, it's pretty minor, I guess. But she,
'Cause Theon's not unattractive in the books.
Right,
He's
right, yeah.
handsome.
And she also thinks that how she's been trained to do all these things and how her self-worth has been kind of destroyed because she doesn't think she can beat Arya, but she thinks back to this very thing we're talking about, how she's like, well, I was prettier than her. So maybe at least I can get it. Maybe at least that will help, because she's like scared of how she's going to be received, scared she's going to be discovered. And so she's taking a little bit of stock in that, being like, well, maybe this will help, that maybe he'll at least find me pretty, right? Like that'll maybe cause him to be less violent towards me if he at least, you know, likes how I look. So she's just trying to assuage some of her own fears with that. And it's difficult because, you know, it's with Ramsay that, you know, there's just nothing stopping him. He's just so unhinged. And trying to please too. This is also speaks to the way she was forcibly trained, and why she's taking stock in being pretty, because she thinks she's been taught that that's her social value. And if it works out, then yeah, real bad. Let's see, what else do we have here? And it's also kind of it also speaks to something happening elsewhere in the story. We have Wyman planning on using Rickon's wolf as the proof that he's really Rickon. And that's going to come up as well for perhaps the real Arya. If Arya meets Justin Massey, then she's going to have to prove who she is. And there may be different ways for her to go about doing that. Likewise, if Jane meets Arya again, then that'll be interesting. Or if Sansa finds out what Littlefinger did to her best friend, oh boy, more reasons for Sansa to be very violent towards Littlefinger, not like she needs more reasons for that, but this could really kick it into a higher gear if she finds out what was done with all the forced sex work and the marriage to Ramsay. And of course, it also relates to Aegon, young Griff, and identifying him. Who's going to prove he's real? Who's going to argue against it? Well, when we've talked about that, it usually comes down to Varys and the symbols of power and showing associations to Rhaegar and all these other things that make people believe it, rather than, because there's no direct evidence they can show. There's obviously no DNA test or anything like that. So, okay, last few bits here. Note that Sir Hostine Frey, who hears that Stannis is marching immediately, says, let's ride out to battle to fight him. And that might be foreshadowing for the Battle of Ice, because after all, the widely believed theory is that Hostine's aggressiveness is what Stannis is counting on, that he's going to lead him out. Hostine is going to lead his men towards Stannis' position across the frozen lake, which will then perhaps collapse under them. And, well, then we'll see what happens after that. But if that works, it'll be looking pretty good for Stannis. Dan Windsor sends a super chat, says, I'll be listening on my way to work tomorrow. See you guys then. Heck yeah. Appreciate that, Dan. We do have the podcast version is always up by early morning. Hopefully by the time people start their commutes. Not always. Sometimes I'm up till 7 in the morning getting it done. This one is probably going to be one of those since it's longer, but hopefully it's there by the time you guys start your commute. If not, it'll be there shortly after. So at one point, Theon thinks how he hopes his best hope at this point is hoping that Stannis succeeds. Stannis comes, takes the castle, and kills them all. And at the end of Theon's T-Wow chapter, that's kind of what's happening. Asha's trying to convince Stannis to do exactly that. Go to Winterfell, take it, but execute Theon not through burning. And that might be Bran speaking through the ravens in that chapter as well. Which leads us to a question: why is Bran speaking to Theon here in this chapter and in that chapter? Why is Bran concerned with Theon at all? One answer is something that he perceives in the future, something that's like within the realm of his powers to perceive that Theon's going to be important. Bran's a nice kid. He may have seen what Theon's been through, may forgive him and think, okay, you've suffered enough. Calling him by his name might be like, hey, you're Theon, like helping him restore his identity. But that still begs the question, why? Why is he helping Theon recover his identity? Is it because he wants Theon to rescue Jane or something like that? Or does he see him as a means to helping free Winterfell? Something, I don't know. But it's a very curious question. Why is Bran speaking to Theon? I would love to hear your takes on that. Archmaester Rennie says, of all the weddings, this is one of the very few that's not interrupted by some major event, and it's kind of too bad it isn't, because, yep. Also a note from Joe that Jane is dressed in the same, it's not a Tokar, but it's freshwater pearls indicating fertility, as Dany would be, so that's kind of neat little crossover there. Also, Sophia notices some wordplay. All the color had been leached from Winterfell. Very nice. That's a really good catch. And all the color had been, coming up, Theon is going to dominate the narrative a lot. He's going to be, I think, the second most prominent in terms of quantity. We had a Theon chapter last week. Then we have this one. Altogether, 5 of his 7 chapters fall within the next, say, 20. So basically, the next stretch is like 1/4 Theon when we have 18 POVs. So, and a lot of his role is an observer, and there's a lot to see here. So, indeed. Last week we covered 162 minutes, 35 seconds. This week, I forgot to take note of how much. So I don't know. It's a very similar number. I think it's about 150 this time. So far, we've covered 1,514 minutes of the 2,922. So we did just cross the halfway point. We are 51.8% of the way through. Don't forget to check out our website if you want to re-listen to specific chapters. Shea has set it up so you can very easily find the chapters you're looking for. You can click on the specific ones. The timestamps will take you right there. So that's pretty cool. Very efficient and helpful. Don't forget to leave a like on the video and or the podcast itself if that's where you're listening to. It really does help our exposure, helps us get noticed, helps prime us for the algorithms, so to speak, for lack of a better term. As usual, we mention a few of the episodes from our back catalog that are referenced here. Generally, those are scripted episodes, so they're a little bit tighter in terms of their production. The quotes are read by usually someone like McCall or one of our other recurring voice guests. And so we have music and things like that, so a little bit higher production quality. We mentioned the Battle of Ice. We mentioned Lies in Arbor Gold. We mentioned Blood Ravens 3 episodes and vaguely referenced some of the other Blackfire stuff. And we also referenced the Weirwood episodes, which were particularly relevant this time. So you've got some other fodder for episodes to check out if you'd like to go deeper into these rabbit holes or prepare yourself for more theorizing or just general A Song of Ice and Fire enjoyment. That is why we're here, after all. Next time, 4 more chapters. Interestingly enough, it's going to be our first chapter outside of the North or Essos. We got The Watcher, Vows Before the Red Viper's Grave, a.k.a. It's My Skull in a Box.
John 8, The one where Val is an ambassador, aka the Doom of Hardhome.
Ooh. Tyrion 9, The Storm in the Flames, aka the Stinky Steward Smells a Slaver.
And finally, the Turncloak, the Heart Tree Weeps, aka Return to the Crypts of Winterfell.
Oh, yeah. We're going to be going down into the crypts with Lady Dustin and Theon. They'll be saying, what happened to those swords? And who are all these statues? Yeah, that'll be fun. Until then, thank you all for coming. If you came and participated live, extra thanks for that. You really do add a lot to our production and our experience. It's really fun for people to chat live, and I'm glad that you all come to do that. If you can't watch it live, or if you prefer to catch it afterwards, we appreciate the downloads, the streams, the likes, the upvotes, and you telling your friends. Certainly, if you have decided to pledge to us on Patreon or through Anchor or through manual donations, super, super appreciate that. It's very much appreciated, especially this time of year when everybody has so many different things to spend money on. The season for giving, it is December, what's the date? It's December 13th today as of this recording. So yeah, we are in that time of year, in case you're hearing this later. So thanks to Joe and Nina for their invaluable writing assistance. Definitely check out their work. That's the Isle of Faces podcast and goodqueenalley.tumblr.com with one L in alley. Thanks to our mods over on Facebook for hosting the discussions and posting fan art and all that to facilitate the discussions. Ditto over on Discord, Slack, and Flick. We've got a lot of fantastic discussions going on every week. Not always about A Song of Ice and Fire, but that is, of course, the main thing. For example, this week there were some discussions of the castings on House of the Dragon, which there will be more and more of going forward as more and more characters get cast, because there's going to be a lot of characters. That is a... we don't know exactly who's going to all be cast for Season 1, because some of the characters probably won't appear till Season 2, assuming they get that far. But still, even Season 1 alone will be a substantial cast. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld, a.k.a. Claradox.de, Klaradox.de. That's his website. Check him out. Also, thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the Valar Rereadis intro music. Thanks to Joey Townsend and Jesse Kowal for our recurring History of Westeros music intro and outro. Thanks to our Bengineer for the sound quality assistance. And if you are a fan of The Expanse, go check out Here Be Dragons. They're talking about one of the cooler characters on that show/book, Kamina Drummer. And that's it. Everyone, we'll see you next time for more Valar Rereadis.